Okay, let's just go grab a can of iron brew. I think I'm going to need one. Because tonight's going to be a fun one. Right, it's going to be a really fun one. In answer to your questions, I have brushed the poodle, who's currently short on water, so... Hello everyone, why is that decided to flick? Oh, goodness gracious me. Very helpful. Very helpful. Hello everyone. Poodle's water bowl is empty. Hadn't realised. I think he just drained it in the time I've been. I quickly had to use the facilities after walking him and sorting everything else out. So I'll be back in a second. I'm just filling up the dog bowl. Water bowl is empty. Yes, I brought you water. Have you literally just come back and drained this water bowl and you're now planning to drain it again? Because the way you're following me, it looks like you're planning on draining the water bowl again. I should warn you, if you manage to drain 2 water bowls in less than 20 minutes, I will decide the steroids you're on are overacting. Hello everyone, sorry about that. Poodle is currently on steroids for his ears, and it means he really shouldn't be without water. He really shouldn't be without water. Hello, how are you all doing? How is everyone? Are you enjoying yourselves? Right then, I have brew. I have brew. Hello everyone. I have one can at a time because that way it allows me to measure my intake, let's say. Makes me better. Hello everyone. So, welcome. Because this is the topic this is, I do expect there to be a lot of current political debate going on in this topic at various points in both this and the recorded video when it comes out. In a week, next week. And I will say this. This is not a political commentary. This is about lessons of war. That's the point. And this is Lessons of War by a naval historian, so it's going to focus on the naval sides and aspects of the campaign. Which is fun, because there have been some very interesting pronouncements recently about naval aspects of certain campaigns, haven't there? Hello, yes. You good boy. Do you want something? Have you decided there is a need? You've got food, but you've decided there is a need for something because you are live, the camera's live, you're talking to everyone, so it's time to milk the audience for PTs, is it? Is that it? You're milking the audience. You literally are milking my audience for PTs. Hello, Marcus the Scandian. Hello. Hello, Twitch and YouTube. So, life. Today we are going to be talking about, has Ukraine war confirmed, dispelled, or updated Falklands lessons? It's fun. It is fun. because some of those lessons are actually things which are very interesting. One of the most, because of doing this video, and I had to look into what lessons of Ukraine were, and I also, of course, there are some books, but they are very early on in the campaign, and most of them are written about. And there's some other scholarly articles and things to go around, and some papers written by various people who have been informed. And of course, there's a whole load of YouTube videos. And, well, some of the recent YouTube videos about the lessons of Ukraine are intriguing. You see, a very famous commentator, and I don't want this to be considered a personal criticism, it isn't, but it just shows to me how you can be very smart in one area and presume you're smart in the others, and actually you're not, because you haven't gone and done the fundamental research. A very famous commentator recently said that, you know, Ukraine has shown that you can't operate within 100 miles of the coast anymore because of the rise of uncrewed surface vehicles and these sort of things. And, well, here's the thing. The Japanese were using suicide craft, kamikaze boats, in World War II. Motor torpedo boats, mines, small coastal submarines, and aircraft have been a thing, well, since not only World War II, but quite a lot of them were present in World War I, along with coastal artillery. In fact, most navies that came out of World War II, and have still been operators, have been operating on a policy that they need to be 200 miles offshore, if they're dealing with a peer threat, or a near-peer threat. There is a reason why the total exclusion zone around the Falkland Islands is 200 miles in 1982. 200 nautical miles. That's roughly 230-something miles, I think. And this has been around for a long, long time. So, I'm sorry, if the people who are drawing the conclusions are going, now you can't operate within 100 miles, the navies have been ahead of you for a long, long time. It's been that reality. And this is the thing. The reason I think this is quite so shocking to so many people who get involved is because to them, 100 miles is a long way. To navies, 100 miles is half a morning. It's a few hours sailing, and they sail for 24 hours a day, every day. When we're talking about naval warfare, we're often talking about campaigns which take place over thousands of nautical miles. Sometimes tens of thousands of nautical miles once you include the whole trips and whole routes they're taking out. So, 100 miles is really not a lot. It's really not. Now, then we get into the fact, you know, you don't want to operate within 100 miles unless you're coming in heavy. 200 miles is where we prefer to operate out of. If we're in the 100 to 200 miles region, you can go in, but be careful. And if you're going into less than 100 miles, you go in heavy, i.e. in task force strength. And this is one of the things which is constantly being forgotten. It was forgotten right into the Falklands War. It was forgotten during the Cold War. It constantly gets relearned and forgotten. You don't operate solo ships if you can avoid it. People go, well, what about the Age of Sail frigates? They often operated solos. They did in areas of low threat. In areas of high threat, they operated in packs of frigates. You can look them up. The frigate squadrons, the independent squadrons of frigates in the Age of Sail, and how they were the best groups for hunting down trade. Why? Because they tended to operate in places like the Channel and places which were contested with a lot of merchant traffic. And the reason they operated as a group of frigates was because that was where the threat was heavy. So they had friends to back them up. It's that simple. It's that easy. And this is the reality, and this is also one of the reasons why whenever I'm talking about things like Star Trek, I find it annoying, because they send off a solo ship. They send off a single ship to go and do things. And frankly, that isn't how anyone sensible acts. You send off at least a pair of ships. You have them working in tandem. Probably, especially if you're going into the unknown, you have 2 or 3 frigate wolfpacks. That's pretty much what they were. You don't do these things stupidly or solely. You are actually sensible with it. Now, amphibious warfare. Apparently, this is no longer possible, according to some, because of the lessons of Ukraine. I hate to inform you about this, but it is possible. It's going to be costly. You're going to have to be smart about it. You're going to have to do a lot of planning, commitment of firepower to achieve it. But it's still possible. And the point is, though, there have always been areas where you don't want to carry out amphibious operations. You don't tend to try and land in a place which is already defended. You tend to try and land elsewhere, or where there are minimal defences, where you can suppress the defence in some ways. If we consider in World War II, they landed in Normandy, not the Pas de Calais. They didn't try and seize a port. They had to relearn that lesson after Dieppe, but frankly, they should have remembered that from the previous incidents that they've learned that lesson. You don't try and seize a heavily defended port. It ain't gonna go well. The fact they needed to pay in blood for that lesson is disturbing. But no, you can't just keep demanding them. I know you've been ill, but you can't keep demanding them. You're cute, but you're not that cute. Now, again, when talking amphibious warfare, usually what we end up talking about is things like, well, where are we going to land? Well, the Mulberry Harbours were a good example. You sometimes have to create your own infrastructure. The Chinese have gone to a similar but different thing for what they're doing. And, well, that's life. You start adapting to the situation you're going to face. But also, believe it or not, mines, as they originally were called torpedoes, before we developed the Whitehead torpedo, so torpedoes became something and then mines became something else, were a thing for a long time. Cannon, all these things have been growing up. Aircraft, all these things have been coming about. And don't get me started on the whole thing of artillery being replaced by drones and stuff like that, which comes up recently. I'm sorry, artillery was going to be replaced, first of all, by aircraft. That didn't happen. The aircraft got more expensive. The artillery still stayed efficient. Then tube artillery was going to be replaced by rocket artillery. That didn't happen. Because, again, tube artillery was just so darn efficient. Then you weren't going to need artillery because of the way wars were going to be fought. And, well, sadly enough, you did. No, you're not getting this particular cube. You've already broken it. If you keep being naughty, you go back to your bedroom. Although it is good that you're getting better. And, things have kept going on. Now artillery is to be replaced by drones. Well, I doubt it. If you consider what the aircraft started out as spotting for artillery, what has been the role which artillery have been looking to replace for many years? Spotting for artillery, to make artillery more lethal. And that's usually what happens. Artillery can get more lethal, but also it depends on what you want to do with the drones. This is the thing. The more you want to do with them, the more complicated, more expensive, and bigger they tend to get. Information is key. Getting it early enough to do something with it is critical. That is a lesson from World War II. That has been a lesson for every war. He who knows what the enemy is doing before the enemy realizes what you are doing tends to be able to decide what's going to happen in the battle. Isn't that right, Poodle? That is right. And then we have layers of defense. Now, this is something which comes up again and again, and we have to relearn almost every major war. And if you consider, and the reason I'm starting off World War II, is we are now further from the Falklands War than the Falklands War is from World War II. It was 37 years between the Falklands War and World War II, and lessons had been forgotten. It is now 43 years from the Falklands War, when the current conflict broke out in Ukraine in 2022. You're dealing with it being 40 years. 40 years from the Falklands War. And this is the reality. Occasionally you need to relearn the same lessons. So a lot of the lessons, by the way, that get taught and get learnt in these conflicts are repeats, because they get forgotten. Because people go down the theory of, but our engineers and scientists and the people selling us these weapons say these can do things. Because if we get this system, which is more effective, it'll be cheaper. Because, in theory, we only need one ship to do this job, and we're sure we'll have it available when war happens. You see, the realistic problem about war and conflict as a whole is it is so horrible. It is so unnatural to think of it in some regards that people don't really think about it. They think about an idealized version of it, a clean, scientific version of it, rather than the messy, nasty, horrible thing it is, where you are literally pitting human minds against human minds with the job of seeing who can kill the most quickly and most efficiently. It is not clean, it is not nice, and it is not in any way, shape or form done politely. It is rather horrific. It is war. And the idea that people are going to wait around to suit your timetables of availability, that they are going to fight it in a way you have preordained, so you will be perfect, everything will go perfectly, is abhorrent to the entire function of logic. And then we have the worst thing, which has to be relearned every time there's a war. Yes, ships can get sunk. No one wants them to, but they can get sunk. It's a lesson of history. If you're not sure about this, read some history books. The ships often get sunk. And don't believe the idea of, oh, but it's newer, it's modern, it's got this fancy missile system or this system. No, they can still get sunk. Sometimes you can do everything right, and you will still lose in war. Because it's not a game. Because the enemy gets a vote. So this is what we're talking about today. This is what we're talking about today. So with that being said, it's going to be Falklands War. Then it's going to be Shameless Book Plug, and then it's going to be Ukraine. Okay? Let me just check. For some reason, someone's messaging me. Yeah. Alright, I'm now going to mute my phone and make sure it stays muted for a bit. My favourite quote: in war, the only winning move is not to play. My favourite quote is Arthur Wellesley: the only thing worse than a battle won is a battle lost. If you have to wage war, win it, because otherwise it is too terrible to have fought it. And as said, we're going to keep the politics to a minimum. This is about war analysis, and I know that's hard. I know there's often desire for political debate, but this is a history channel, and while this is to an extent current affairs discussion, this is one of those times where I'm going to go, I don't want the discussion to become dominated by party politics. I want it to be a discussion of the facts and events. And I often find that the moment you get any party politics going on from any nation, it becomes very tribal, and you don't get the proper information out of it, because people try and pretend that different groups are any better or informed than others, and they're really not. He does believe you're here. Wayne, stop giving him those ideas. He does believe you're all here to see him. Now, distance works both ways. This is the interesting thing about the Falklands War, and I'm going to be referring to the topic of geography a lot. Geography sets the pace and events of a conflict far more than anything anyone would often like to admit. If you can it can put you in range of the enemy weapon systems. It can also put you at the end of their range, where they have little time to think or coordinate their actions. And you see, the interesting thing about the Falklands War is it's an expeditionary war on both sides. It's an expeditionary war on both sides. It's a logistical war on both sides. But here's the really weird thing. The British are 8,000 miles away, but at this time they have quite a strong Royal Fleet auxiliary, and are able to take ships up from trade, which are called stuffed, ships taken up from trade, literally. So they're stuffed ships. And they're able to keep the force quite well supplied, and quite well organised. Now, when I say well organised, that is for a given level of organisation, because here's something which people often forget. The fleet leaves Britain. The amphibious forces especially leave Britain, but also some escorts come from Gibraltar, etc. And they get to Ascension Island. And at Ascension Island, they have to do a lot of rejiggering of the loading of the ships, especially the ones that do with the amphibious operations. Why? Because they've been loaded in a hurry. They have been loaded in a hurry. And I once had a long conversation about this particular topic. And so when they get to Ascension, they have to try to load them into what they call a combat load. This means when you're loading a ship for an amphibious operations, you have to load it so what you want out last goes on first, so it's deepest in the ship, and what you want out first goes on last. Now, here's the thing. What you tend to want off first from a ship is going to be the stuff which is easy and quick to carry, because that's the stuff which is going to go to the troops straight away after landing. That's also the easiest and quickest stuff to load. And if you're doing a mass loading, as they were often doing for these ships heading to Falklands War, they were just cramming stuff on as quickly as possible. So they got an entire mishmash. It was absolutely organised chaos. And this is no discredit to anyone involved. It wasn't. But it's just the situation you're in. They were rushing. They had to get the fleet out. They had to get the task group off. They had to show the world that Britain was actually willing to fight. Britain was willing to do this. So everything had to go, 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 go. And that led to issues. That led to issues. Now, the thing is, for the British, with these supplies, that meant that they would have the supplies brought down, and then they'd sort the things out from the Falkland Islands. Once they got them on Ascension, once they got the ships to San Carlos Bay or to the task group, or the carrier battle group, etc., they could sort out the supplies and move them around as they needed to. So they were basically functioning at sea. And as long as they had enough ships, they could rotate them out. As long as they had enough forces available there to do the fighting, they were fine. And this is where the issue usually comes up. When people start asking me if Britain could still do the Falklands War today, I'd go, I usually respond, A, we do it very differently, and B, the biggest problem is actually the Royal Fleet Auxiliary. The biggest problem is the RFA. You need more shit. The RFA needs to be rebuilt. And that's the biggest problem for doing this kind of operation this far, because you're going to have to send a very large task group. And you have to remember the Falklands War actually involved more ships than we currently have in the Royal Navy. And you're going to have to sustain it. Now, I know you will have some questions and some interesting questions, and I will talk about them at the end. But I'm not going to get off them because today, not going to get on them to extent. So I'll answer some Falklands War questions when we get to the shameless book plug thing. So there's, I think, see a question like Clarke has put in, and if someone can make sure they get one of the admins, if they're in the chat, can please copy the questions off to one side because I haven't got the bot running. That'd be very kind of you, because I'll do the bot as I do it normally at the end. But yeah, and then I'll answer some of them. Now, the thing is, for the Argentinians, theoretically, they would claim they're very, very close. They're really, really close. And so that's often the basis of their argument of the Falklands being theirs, proximity. It's not really a good argument, because if you can make the argument about proximity, then, you know, in the nicest way, that soon causes issues, because there's lots of nations which have lots of little bits of land off other people, and if proximity argument wins, it doesn't work. And so, for the Argentinians, though, because their fleet was forced back, because they were forced out of the total exclusion zone, because of the size of the total exclusion zone, remember that 200 miles radius around the Falklands, so it has 400 miles across, and because that total exclusion zone helped to also keep out civilian ships and other things which are getting away, so you don't have accidental targets. Excuse me. Oh, Sissy's back. Sorry, a second. The poodle's gonna be a little bit noisy for a second. My sister's just pulled in. Now, Raleigh, here, good boy, good boy. Now, the thing is, for the Argentinians, therefore, they are forced to stay back. They're operating from their bases at home, which should be an advantage. It should be a home court advantage because they have all their infrastructure, everything set up there. But the Argentinians really didn't have a lot of infrastructure set up. The Argentinians' armed forces were, in many ways, in terms of peer-on-peer conflict, probably closer to a crust than they were an actual solid structure. And that's their problem. They have these forces, but are they able to sustain them? Are they able to project them? And that's the reason why you have a lot of uncoordinated attacks, realistically. I know the BBC did their best to give impartial commentary and helpfully told the world that the reason the Argentinians hadn't managed to sink more British ships at that point was because the bombs hadn't been fused correctly, but we'll leave that to one side. Ay, caramba. We'll leave that to one side. That's one of those areas of history which is always a bit of fun. Not very fun for the Royal Navy personnel down there and the other members of the forces down there, but, you know, it's one of those pieces of history where you sit there and look at it and go, and this got said out loud because you felt the world needed to know, because it showed how impartial a news service you were? Really? Helpful? Now, the thing is, it's the way the war goes, though. The Argentinians do deploy exocets to the Falkland Islands and fire them from the Falklands, and famously poor HMS Glamorgan gets hit and various things happen like that. But again, the same geography is also quite useful for the amphibious warfare operations, as I'll be getting into as we go further in this. Because amphibious warfare is also more about geography than anything else. And the lesson of the Falklands War was the geography still matters a lot. One of the things they were looking for in the Falklands War were spaces like they were used to operating, because you have to remember the Royal Navy had been very focused at this point around being built around NATO. and NATO function and NATO responsibility. They're built around the NATO requirements of their force. That's what the government keeps hiding behind at this point. We have to focus on our NATO commitments. We have to focus on our NATO commitments. And the thing is, that's a problem. Focusing on NATO commitments sounds great, and when you sort of think, oh, well, they're going to build balanced forces to help out NATO. No. It has meant, pretty much since the 60s, a slowly greater and greater specialization of forces as different nations decide they're going to pay for different bits of a force structure to save money so they don't spend for the rest. And this is one of the reasons why, when it comes to the Falklands War, if we consider the guy who coordinated naval gunfire support in the Falklands, was a British Army colonel. He was the last officer trained in it in the British Armed Forces. He wasn't supposed to go to the Falklands, and he managed to sneak aboard. And when the Royal Navy and Royal Marines finally is aboard, they adopt him immediately and go, "Woohoo, we've got you!" But he wasn't supposed to be there. That was a capability which could very easily have gone completely. There was literally one officer remaining in the armed forces, in the British Armed Forces, who knew how to do it, because, well, it's not something Britain's going to have to do solo. If we do it, we'll be doing it as an allied operation, so our NATO partners can do it. And oh, it gets worse there, Cry. You're wondering how it gets worse. It gets worse. The Falklands is a huge lesson in why you don't do this. And by the way, we've merrily carried on doing this since the Falklands. When the person who's planning this operation, and it's Commodore Michael Clarke who really takes the lead he's in command of the Amphibious Task Group, and he's organising this and planning out the operation, along with a guy called Julian Thompson, who's the brigadier in charge of 3rd Commando Brigade at this point, and would be the senior Royal Marine until Jeremy Moore arrived, who was a Major General to command the light division they deployed once 5th Brigade arrived, and a guy called Major Ewan Sotheby Taylor. Now, Ewan Sotheby Taylor has written a whole load of books. He's a really cool author. Him and Michael Clarke actually have a joint book on the Falklands War, and it's worthwhile reading. And what you realise when you talk to these gentlemen, and I have been lucky enough to spend a lot of time talking to them, they are spectacular dudes. They really are. You start to realise that the criteria Michael Clarke was applying was that of a Blackburn Buccaneer, navigation and observer officer, who had been a squadron commander as an observer. He was probably one of the best trained ship-killing aircraft commanders and squadron commanders in the world at this point. He's probably one of the people who spent some of the most time in the world in 1982 thinking about how to kill ships with aircraft. And now he's on the other side trying to defend his aircraft from ships. And the thing he always remembers in mind is that whilst aircraft can fly over things, missiles require a run-in, and rock trumps missile. That's it. Rock trumps missile. So he's looking for a fjord. He's looking for something like he has in Norway, so that they can't fire missiles at him. They've got to pop up over and come bomb him, because he knows that's going to put him at a disadvantage. They're going to have to come into him. They can't stand off out of range. The carrier battle group doesn't have to be tied to defend him. He can use the very geography to come and defend it. Now, the other advantage he has is he has Ewan Sotheby Taylor, who had been a commander of the Naval Party a couple of cycles previously in the Falkland Islands, of the Royal Marines in the Falkland Islands, and had spent his time sailing, kayaking, doing all sorts of lovely things around the Falklands. What he didn't know about the beaches and wasn't in his notes wasn't really worth knowing. He was absolutely a spectacular source of information. And by the way, he was the guy in charge of the landing craft for the war. He's in charge of the landing craft. So that ship-to-shore manoeuvre, those landing craft, they all report to Sotheby Taylor. They all report to him. And so they're sitting there working them out, and they pick out San Carlos Bay. Now, this whole thing is actually a bit of a surprise to the Argentinians because, you see, the Argentinians had a small problem. The Argentinians had a small problem. They had been training a lot of the Americans. And this had led them to two things. One, they thought the Americans were going to keep the British out of the war because we are the valued allies of America, so they'll never let the British fight us. Yeah. This is why I say, when people say it's a new thing, that America, so isn't always that supportive of its allies, it does what it's in its interest, as all nations do. It's got a better rep than, it's got a better PR than most, but yeah, it's the same as all nations. And, well, they found out that wasn't going to work. And then they thought that, the US Marines' view was that you do a coup de main. You always land straight into the strongest point of your enemy. So they expected, from their US Marine training, the way they'd interpreted their US Marine training, that the Royal Navy and Royal Marines, who of course were NATO allies of America, would have the same doctrine and would all land at Port Stanley. And I've had this confirmed for me because I never really believed it. I've talked to some veterans, etc., who said it to me, and I was going, really? But I actually talked to when I was one of the organisers of a conference, the 37th anniversary conference for the Falklands War. I had a conversation with a academic historian from South America who'd spent a lot of time with Argentinian officers. And he honestly, his honest thing he expressed to me was that their honest assessment was they couldn't understand why the Royal Marines didn't behave like they expected the US Marines would behave. Why not to do it? Why they wouldn't do that? And I went, well, in the nicest way, surely the first thing that dawned on me, even if they expect the US Marines to do such a stupid thing as to land into the strongest place, the US Marines can turn up with a divisional strength formation. We're talking a commando brigade. Why did I think the Royal Marines would use a brigade to do what the US Marines wouldn't do with a division? But they honestly did expect a coup de main. They expected them to come and land straight into the face of the enemy. Whereas, of course, what did the British actually do? We went over to San Carlos Bay, which was actually closer to the Argentina than Port Stanley. We landed there. We set up a forward operating base. We set up logistics. And we'd planned on using helicopters to assist us in manoeuvring across the island. Unfortunately, the helicopters were lost to a Exocet strike hitting a vessel called the Atlantic Conveyor. And so the Royal Marines yomped across. As they had put it, walking as the rest of you might call it, but they yomped across. They yomped across. And that was that. They moved across, they brought artillery with them, they had fire support from naval gunfire support because, believe it or not, 4.5-inch guns are very good at fire support in terms of that terms and in providing AA fire against things like, well, small drones and bear bombers, but they are not really very good, designed for dealing with supersonic missiles. And I don't think anyone's ever claimed they were, so I'm not sure why 96831 just asked that question. I really don't. But you know. If it's done well, amphibious operator warfare is a very good capability to have. And the point is, since William Pitt, the British have been landing where the enemy isn't to develop from there. This is how you approach it. So when I see someone going, amphibious warfare is dead, no. Amphibious warfare, if you're going to conduct it, A, needs to be properly supported, have the proper level of escorts and firepower, and B, needs to be done with respect for your opponent and their capabilities. And C, you need to make sure you're able to land and support or sustain yourself where the enemy isn't, so you can build yourself up and fight it. Now, on the fighting terms, this is, by the way, is pure British, okay? And it's pure British, and it's pure British of this period, and it shows some of the issues that had happened. The Royal Navy had, at the front of the group, the first frigate to come in to the Falklands, the first frigate to enter San Carlos Bay, was HMS Phoebe. I thought it was Phoebe. It was one of the Leander class. I think it was Phoebe, or was it the other one? It was one of the ones which has had its exocet completely refitted. Completely refitted. I think it was Phoebe from the book, but I will check that. And they received instructions to use their 4.5-inch guns. If the enemy attacks, engage with guns. The trouble is, she no longer had 4.5-inch guns. They've been replaced by exocet missiles. So she could return fire with machine guns. I think it was Phoebe. It's a fun time. And this has led to, of course, a continued interesting discussion of guns' values on modern ships. And the realistic answer is guns are more valuable than people like to talk about, because if you're trying to sell missiles, then the fact you still need guns makes you look kind of, well, what's the value of the missiles? What's happened? And the fact is, you need the guns because they add breadth of capability. And that's especially useful for the layers scenario. But first of all, we've got to talk about Falklands War information. We've got to talk about information. Now, these days, information warfare tends to be talked about purely as social media and your ability to discuss things, protect things in the press, etc., how you shape the information of war. However, in this sense, I'm talking about information as in the information you get, your reconnaissance information, your airborne early warning, all that information, every piece of information you can get as in someone in command. And here's the really fun lesson of the Falklands War, because under NATO, the British had decided not to procure airborne early warning for the carriers. They had the designs, they had the information all worked out, they just hadn't done it. Why? Well, you see, they're going to go up to do delivery into Norway, and in UK, they'll have, of course, UK airborne early warning. They'll have Norwegian airborne early warning and other NATO powers providing airborne early warning to cover for them. Oh, and the American carriers will be there and they'll provide airborne early warning. So we don't need airborne early warning. Here's the thing of how much of it had been developed. I want you to think about this. The British deploy down to the Falklands. First goes the first task group based around Invincible and Hermes. Okay? The task group which goes down immediately as the war's ending and is going down to take over the operations down there, led by HMS Bristol and also involving HMS Illustrious. HMS Illustrious is carrying helicopters with airborne early warning system support. AEW. And here's the really sad and annoying thing about it. If you have airborne early warning in the Falklands, you probably cut British ship losses by a good 30 to 40%. Minimum. Especially things out with the carrier battle group like the Atlantic Conveyor. which then mean you have helicopters to do the full movement, which speeds up the war. And if you make war faster, you tend to suffer less casualties overall. Having an Aegis type system doesn't help in this scenario. We're talking about Medi. It's a very nice system to have. It's very useful for your carriers if you're under sustained missile attack and missile bombardment. Aegis is a wonderful system. As it was developed in this period, it's about dealing with mass missile attacks. But it still can't see around the curvature of the Earth. That's why we have airborne early warning radar, so that you can go up, you can take your radar up high and look down. And so, what you're really dealing with is the fact that the British didn't have these capabilities. They also don't have even the first, and these had started in the 1970s, rudimentary steps towards a cooperative engagement capability. And by the way, we still don't have it on our modern warships. You see, every time the Royal Navy puts for it to be fitted on ships, it gets deleted by the people who decide the cost-benefit analysis of procurement. Every single time. We've been looked at buying the American system. I think we've looked at buying the Australian system, the Japanese system, the French system, building our own systems for cooperative engagement systems, and we just don't get it. Every time we look at it, and we don't get it. Now, please note I've listed as airborne early warning, not AWACS, because AWACS is airborne warning and control. AEW is about providing the warning. The control will still probably usually be done from the carrier, because the aircraft may have limited capabilities of control, but it doesn't usually say it have the same number of people as we would associate with a large AWACS system. This is one of the interesting things when we get into the whole discussion of Hawkeye versus Wedgetail. Do you want an aircraft which can do full battle space control, or do you want an aircraft which is a sensor node? And before people get too mad at me, yes, you can do control from a Hawkeye, but a Hawkeye is not spaced out to control the kind of battle space you're talking about of NATO over Europe or anything like that. It's spaced out to control a carrier battle group's air group. The problem the British had was a lack of reconnaissance capability. Realistically, most of the reconnaissance that the British were able to do was Special Forces based. The Royal Marines, especially the Mountain and Arctic Warfare, the Mountain and Arctic Warfare cadre, and various other sections of the Royal Marines and SAS, so SBS and SAS, were doing a huge amount of reconnaissance. A huge amount of information was being gathered by them. Now, as we go through the war, lots of these things start to build up. One of the things, as you might notice was mentioned earlier, was that when we talked about San Carlos Bay, the rocks defended San Carlos Bay. They helped defend it. You might have heard about the sinking of the Sir Galahad and the damage to the Sir Tristram. Two round table class LSLs, landing ship logistics. And Michael Clapp was overall their commander. And he asked several people if they were space they were going to, if the hills were high enough to hide them. If the hills where they were being sent to were high enough to hide them. And he was promised that they were. He looked at a map. It was iffy, but he was promised they were high enough to hide them, and where they'd be put, they'd be high, and they'd be hit, they'd be okay. They, of course, famously weren't. They were spotted by the Argentinians. They were attacked. They were hit. And one of the reasons they were hit was because one of the landing craft had actually been, I wouldn't say kidnapped, but had been borrowed by an army unit to go off and support their manoeuvre, and so they didn't have the landing craft that they were supposed to have in that space to complete the offload quickly enough, so they ended up with having 2 units there rather than one at a time. So, yeah, it caused trouble. But that's what happens sometimes. That's what happens sometimes. And in a funny story, it adds on to that. The next LSL which was sent in there, Mike Clarke actually got a helicopter ride over to go see it and check on the space himself, and that's when he found out that people hadn't given him correct information. And as a very, 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 very much a West Countryman, and a tall West Countryman, I can imagine the people who'd given him the wrong information were very, very afraid after that, but we'll leave that to one side. He's also one of the nicest people you ever meet, but, you know. The thing is, he went over there, and he was looking for... He went to see that the captain had done a night manoeuvre, getting his ship and everything, and lands on the ship, helicopter goes, "Where's your captain? I think he's in his ready room, sir?" "Okay, don't worry, don't wake him, I'll go to him." Went up to the ready room, found the captain of the LSL asleep, because he was tired. And he went, "Aren't you worried?" I was going, "Nah. It's my job. We're paid to take risks, and frankly, the crew need me. Functioning more than they need me. Sleep deprived and unable to do my job, hassling them. They know what they're doing." So yeah, that was the Royal Fleet Auxiliary, by the way. All those 3 LSLs were Royal Fleet Auxiliaries. Yeah, there is a lack of airlift, but I'd say all of that lesson was definitely not learnt, because if anyone knows anything about Albion and Bulwark, which were 2 LPDs which replaced Fearless and Intrepid, they not only had their hospital deleted, the hospital facilities they planned to be, their gym deleted, they also had their hangar deck deleted. So they were going to have a hangar space, a bit of a gym space, and a hospital facility put on board. Why? Well, the gym was quite simple. If you've got a load of Royal Marines aboard for weeks at a time, you need to keep them fit. You need to keep them healthy, because, believe it or not, you want your troops to be fit and healthy when they are going into operations, don't you? So a gym is useful. A gym is a really useful space on an amphibious warfare ship. And... well, the hospital's kind of self-explanatory. And they deleted the hangar, because you didn't need them. You didn't need the hangar because HMS Ocean existed, and because we've done it before and LPDs didn't have a hangar. And you didn't need... even the LSLs, in the nicest way, half the problems we've had in recent years with our amphibious warfare capability not having to be able to deploy and sustain the helicopters enough has been down to someone having a bright idea. The amount of people who agree a board marine is a very dangerous marine, yes. Now, the thing is, guns are useful, okay? This was a lesson of the Falklands War, because I would love to say Phoebe and other vessels like her Leander class were the only ones to lose their guns, but the Royal Navy had even built a whole batch of Type 22s without guns. Without guns. And the thing is, not only was this not useful from the point of view of naval gunfire support, this means you're reducing your layers of defense. And I would like to point everyone to the most unsung Navy, but if you've ever listened to a Bilge Pumps episode with me, Drac, and Jamie Seedell, you will have heard about this, is the Italian Navy. The Marine Nationale. No, that's the French one. The Italian one, not engaging in a moment, apologies. They are probably the most heavily armed gun-wise of any navy. And excuse me, I'm going to do something strange, but it's going to sort out the camera because the camera keeps flickering. Ba-da-da-da. There we go. Sorry. I'm going to have to get this camera. I'm going to have to get new cables for this camera. Regia Marina. Well, that's what they were. They were called the Royal Navy, but that's when they had a monarchy. I'm not sure they still have. I think it's Marine Militaire. Yeah, Marine Militaire. Anyway. They had some guns on them. They did have some... Leslie's pointing out they had 40mm and 20mm. Yeah, they didn't have those guns synced up to anything they needed to be synced up to. They weren't necessarily helpful. This is the Dutch goalkeeper. This is the Phalanx. If people miss this one was actually one of the coolest weapons ever. It had many weird little party tricks. This one looks like R2-D2. This one had party tricks. You could tell this was a Dutch-designed weapon system. You honestly could tell it was a Dutch-designed weapon system. There are many times in history when you might not be sure about weapon systems, but you can always tell that a goalkeeper is Dutch. It is a good Dutch system. And realistically, this was about going again with the efficiency of missiles, with the efficiency of these weapon systems. These are going to solve our problems. These are going to make warfare safe. These are going to make things efficient. Yeah, it don't work like that. Life ain't that nice. Life ain't that nice. And the reason I bring up the Italian Navy, the Marina Militaire, is because what they provide, and their ships are, they are festooned with weapons. They honestly... Here's the thing. I have a sneaking suspicion if more Texans were aware of how many guns the Italian Navy pack on their ships, they would petition that they be protected by the Italian Navy, not the US Navy. If they saw how covered weaponry they are, they would probably be demanding that they were protected by the Italian Navy, not the US Navy, because they are far more Texan in their approach to weaponry than the US Navy are. The US Navy ships are clean, they have this system, and they're all neat and everything, and then the Italians turn up and it's, "Hello, have you seen my guns? I have the Otto Malera catalogue." They're wonderful. They are wonderful. Hello. And the thing is, the reason the Italians have this is because they're focused on fighting in the Mediterranean. And they know that the Mediterranean, the distances aren't good. Remember, the rule of thumb... Hello. If you want to pat, come up here. If you want to take part, come up in here and have a pat. Don't sit on the floor, whining, basically going, and wagging your tail at me from the floor. So, hello. Oh, good lord, I've been squashed by poodle. So, now, the thing is, the rule of thumb I tend to use, people, is your chances of hitting and stopping something are directly relational to the distance, time, and force. Distance, time, and force. And basically, your likelihood of stopping is distance times time times force. That's a rough rule of thumb. So if you want to hit something, you have a lot of time and a lot of distance to do it. You don't need much force to stop it. You won't need much force to stop it if you have a lot of time, a lot of distance to do so. If you don't have a lot of distance and you don't have a lot of time, you're going to need a lot of force. And basically, if you're planning on fighting in the Mediterranean, if you're dealing with the Mediterranean, there are lots of places where you might have distance and time. There are lots of places where you will not have distance and time. And so for those places, you carry a lot of force. And this is one of the problems I can see coming already when we're talking about lasers and other systems, because these systems sound so good on paper. They're gonna... Dragonfire is going to change the way the world fights. I'm not quoting directly from a slideshow I saw. And it might do. It might do. But the odds are you're still going to need some guns. You're still going to want some guns. Because that gives you flexibility. You see, the thing is, lasers are very good at killing things, as are missiles. They're not very good at firing warning shots. At the moment. Unless we start changing their colours and making them very bright and Star Trek-y. And they're also, and this is a small point, not very good at providing the psychological impact, because you're either being hit or you're not being hit. And that's the thing. In the Falklands War, the thing that the Royal Navy would really have liked is either some sextuple Bofors or some octuple pom-poms. Michael Clarke would have happily gone for either of them. And what he'd have done is every time there was an air raid warning, he'd have had one of those mounts pointed at every single one of the low bits on the hills. The places where the aircraft like to come up over, and just fill the air above that spot with lead. Just fill it with lead. And keep filling it with lead. And this was the point. They had a load of single mounts. They had a load of very nice, very high precision weapon systems. And what he wanted to do wasn't precision. What he wanted to do was fill the sky with lead. Make it an area where, frankly, pilots didn't want to fly. Make it an area which was obviously full of a lot of violence, a lot of danger, a lot of threat, so that the pilots didn't fly through it. And he didn't have those. Now, we often on this channel talk about what would have been the use of HMS Vanguard if she'd been down in the Falklands War. And people go, well, you know, she didn't carry missiles, what should she have done? Would she have engaged the Belgrano? Would she have done this? The thing which she would have done, which would be most useful if she still had her guns on her, especially her cannon, would have been sit in San Carlos Bay, use her 15-inch guns to provide fire support whenever needed for the Marines ashore in overwhelming artillery power. And considering they could angle up to 40 degrees, that would have been more than capable of doing that. And more importantly, fill a lot of the sky with a lot of lead every time aircraft come anywhere nearby them. And there is an advantage to doing that. Yeah, it's not so much a fantasy channel. It's literally the guy who, as I've said, Michael Clarke, is probably, in 1980s, arguably one of the best trained best trained people in the world for coordinating air attacks on ships. He has spent his whole career pretty much thinking about that, working about that, doing it, planning it, sorting it all out. He's worked out all sorts of operations from British carriers as a buccaneer observer. And, you know, that's what they do. And that is what he would have liked. And I'm going to trust that kind of opinion for that experience. On Matthew Killing, I'm kind of surprised that in the aftermath of the war, Royal Navy didn't buy twin 40mm auto and was offering at the time. They did want to. The Royal Navy did want to. And the trouble is, that's where the British government gets involved. And again, one of the things you have to remember is, these guns were considered, one of the phrases which comes up after the Falklands, a lot in times the ship design is, oh, that'd been useful in the Falklands, but is it useful for the NATO mission? I've actually read that in some of the documents which have been not so much secret documents with parliamentary discussions, etc. There are often questions about sort of weapon systems when the Navy was asking for extra cannon and extra guns. Oh, that would have been useful in the Falklands, I understand, but would it be useful for NATO? I don't think so. And you actually have this as a common thing that comes out. And it's one of the interesting things is that the lessons for the Falklands War really didn't start to get applied realistically, properly in British ship design. You could argue that the ship design which has taken the most cues from the Falklands War is the Type 31. Yes, the flak frigate. The frigate that's festooned with guns. And that's another thing which I'm fairly certain, I haven't asked him this question, but I'm fairly certain if you'd given Michael Clapp the stats of that ship and told him, you can have one of these sitting in San Carlos Bay, he'd have been a very, very happy man. Have a couple, because do you know what he did in San Carlos Bay? He defended each end of the bay by sticking Fearless and her sister Intrepid, the two LPDs at either end. And the reason he did that was because they were armed with as many machine guns as he could reasonably get off the ground forces, and would fill the air with as much shrapnel, as much machine gun fire as they physically could. Gareth Farley, it only took me 40 plus years to get to practice. Yes. Anyway, now it's the shameless book plug, where I will say thank you to everyone for liking, sharing, subscribing, supporting the channel, helping it grow. All that stuff is very nice. For those who have never seen him before, this is Raleigh. He's the senior Fluffy research assistant. We do have a corgi, who's called the Fluffy research assistant. They were both promoted just before we moved. This one from Fluffy Research Assistant to Senior Fluffy Research Assistant, and the Corky from Trainee to Fluffy Research Assistant. They're both very good boys, but the Corgi has recently had an operation, and usually hangs out at that end of the house in the evening. It's always quite funny, because basically I tend to have the Corgi tends to keep me company in the early mornings, because someone, and I'm not going to name names, doesn't wake up until it's about lunchtime. And then the Corgi wanders off and has other end of the house to himself, and I get someone else's company. And that's broadly speaking what happens. So usually, you will see in the recordings of videos and those things, you will usually see a senior Fluffy research assistant, because usually I record in the afternoon, and I do my research in the morning. That actually might be why the Corgi hangs out here in the morning, because it's quieter. Who knows? Anyway, there are questions in the Discord, which I'm going to quickly open up, and I'm going to get to the questions about the Falklands War. And I'm going to go to those. Oh, it's been a fun week to putting this together, because I tried to make it as up-to-date as possible on the Ukraine stuff, so I honestly wrote the Falklands War, part of this discussion, about 2 months back. It feels like I wrote it 2 months back. Almost as soon as the question was voted in, I wrote it. And then, of course, I didn't want to, just in case anything weird happened, I didn't want to do the Ukraine bit until really close to it. Paul, this is from Staircraft. Did the Royal Air Force not manage to bomb the runway of the Falklands from Ascension Island? They did. They launched a Vulcan bomber. There's a debate as to how much damage it did. It certainly prevented them putting any jet aircraft operating from the Falklands, although they hadn't been realistically planning to. It doesn't seem to have stopped the Herky-Bird, the C-130 flights in and out of the Falklands. But there again, to an extent, the British let them carry on doing that, because it was kind of useful for the British that they were doing the Herky-Bird flights, as their frequency and intelligence information gained from them tend to give them help the British out more than it was hindering things. Because getting a single Herky-Bird in at night and sending a single one in and out at night wasn't really causing much problems for the British. And the British, if they'd really wanted to stop it, would have just set a Type 42 in its way and told it to shoot it down. There is the right life. Luke Downport, what was the exclusion actually for? Was it a free fire zone or defined combat area? Technically, it was a bit of both. And it was also a scenario the British were using to allow the Argentinians to de-escalate. If they stayed out and didn't show any intention of going into it, then things were fine to an extent, but it was also to keep out civilians of the combat area. And to be honest, the British also had a string policy of, well, if you're an Argentinian ship and you're sailing too close to the exclusion zone, you're going to get taken out, whatever. We're not taking the risk. And part of that was also because the British knew if they did take out the Argentinian ships, and there was a very close run thing where the Argentinians would have lost not just the Belgrano, but also their carrier. But, you know, the British were sort of doing that to keep the Argentinian fleet out of the war, to make them go back to port, to make them keep away. Because they knew if they did that, they were cutting off the best methodology the Argentinians had of causing the British trouble. But basically, it's a legal defilement, because it means that for the British, if they accidentally hit anything, let's say a Soviet trawler which just happened to go into the wrong place, well, we have told everyone this is an exclusion zone. If you've wandered that far into it and you've accidentally got hit because you got mistaken for an Argentinian ship, it's not our fault. We have told everyone. Everyone knows this is an exclusion zone. So it's a bit of politics, a bit of legality. Mr. Clarke, that's, in the nicest way, that's a politics question, not a history question. That's also a loaded question. So if you want a question answered along those, that's anything relevant in that sort of, I'm happy to answer them. But I've said no to politics, so several times this evening. We're not politicizing this. We're not getting into politics side. So, and do it again, and I will quite happily mute you permanently for the evening. Now, Medi, after the Falklands War and the strike, the exercise missile strike, was there a shift towards anti-missile defense systems in the Royal Navy and NATO? That had already been going on to an extent. There was a realization that we had focused our missile defense systems and a lot of defense systems so much on the Russian style of missiles, we'd forgotten we might end up fighting Allied style missiles. That was the big problem, realistically. A lot of the missile defenses were focused on dealing with Russian style threats and Russian style missiles. And the thing is, the Exocet and the Russian systems have very different operational characteristics. Very different operational characteristics. No, is the answer. And that's the reality of it. There is difference in terms of the styles, and so it's at this point that they start actually thinking about it. And it's one of the reasons why it's quite funny to me when people start pointing out like the Russian Caliber missile and go, "Oh yeah, the Allied, and there's no one in the West capable of dealing with this." And you sit there and go, "No," because basically the Falklands War meant they started looking at Western-style missile threats a long time ago, after the Falklands War, and so actually, no, they can deal with Caliber. The fact that the Caliber is something so new for the Russians doesn't mean it's new when you compare it to the style and methodologies of warfare and missiles as used by the French, the British, the Americans, and other allied Western nations. Stop it. Would pom-poms or Bofors have been better 40mm guns in the Falklands? I'd love to say radar-guided Bofors, but that's better. Radar-guided Bofors definitely for the Caraballa group. Definitely radar. But I have a feeling just for the fact you wouldn't have you'd have the belt ammunition rather than clips. You don't have to have the reloading. You don't have to have that break and those people doing that work. I'm reckoning the belt-fed pom-poms would be better for the Amphibious task group, just especially to do that beat-and fire approach on the ridges. Night Hen Productions. I've heard from Eric Brown that Sandy Woodward felt that they had RO9 Ark Royal and her flight group found it at AAW, the war could have been won in a fortnight. Thoughts? Well, that's a very... look, I met Sandy Woodward, and I've met him, and I had a lot of pleasure chatting with him. I also, at several points, got told off by him, but we'll leave that to one side. It was a fun relationship. He was a fun guy. But the thing is, I don't think it would have been 2 weeks. The reason I don't think it's 2 weeks is, yes, you would have probably won the air war, you wouldn't have lost as many ships in it a lot quicker, but you're still going to have to defeat the garrison. And you're going to have to land the troops and do that. The thing is, you would probably have Atlantic conveyor down there, etc., and that would have not sunk. So you'd have that moving more quickly, but you're still going to need to fight a land battle. And this is the trouble. Sandy Woodward is not... Sandy Woodward is interesting because at several points he likes to portray himself as the task force commander, and he's not. He's the carrier battle group commander. He is the senior officer deployed until Jeremy Moore arrives down there, but the thing is, he is a co-equal commander in terms of he's in charge of his task group, the carrier battle group. Michael Clarke is a commodore and is in charge of the amphibious task group. Brigadier Julian Thompson at the time, later on Major General, is in charge of 3rd Commando Brigade, which slots underneath Michael until it's chopped, and then it's when it's ashore and strong enough, and then it's separate command as the land force commander until Julian Moore turns up, and then he takes command of 3rd and Commando Brigade and 5th Brigade. And that's the thing, and the task force commander is a guy called Admiral Fieldhouse back in the UK. He's being task force commander from the UK because they don't deploy a guy called Derek Raffel down there because they're worried if they deploy a vice admiral and we lose, it'll make Britain look bad. So they're sending down they're instead trying to operate a task group from 8,000 miles away with all the issues that creates. Mehdi, was this due to the halos that were taken out, forcing the Navy to share resources with the Army? I think that's to do with the landing craft. Not really. The landing craft were always going to be part of the shared forces. But also there was a lot of problems because the Army units hadn't trained with the Royal Navy and often didn't understand how things worked because they were used to the whole scenario they were supposed to be set up in Germany, etc., where if there was equipment sitting there, you could borrow it. Whereas the Royal Navy, if the equipment's there, it's supposed to be there for something because it's an amphibious operation, and you need it there waiting for this thing to arrive because that needs to be done. And I would say a lot of the Army officers were wholly unprepared for the limits of amphibious operations and the limits of resources. And that's not a critique of them, it's their training. None of their training had involved this. This is the problem often with 5th Brigade, okay? 5th Brigade had never been trained for this. They'd done one exercise together. They'd never taken part in expeditionary operations. They'd never been set up for this. The brigade staff, everything had been pulled together at the last frigging minute. There is absolutely no reason that force should have been sent. It's a nightmare. I'll answer all the questions and then I'll get on with things. Then we have Callan. Did the cost of missiles in 1980s compare to the cost of modern systems, adjusting for inflation, of course? Yeah. Yeah, it's adjusted for inflation, it's roughly the same. Carmen, why did we drop Goalkeeper? Lack of upgrades. The Phalanx has been upgraded more often, although we haven't invested in those upgrades. And the Sandlights on one system. Nighthawk Productions. Would the 3-inch Mark N1 guns originally fitted on Tiger-class cruisers have been up to task? They would have been incredibly useful, Nighthawk Productions. They would have been. A Tiger-class cruiser armed with 3-inch and 6-inch guns down there would have been very, very useful for the Royal Navy. Knight 6831 already answered that one, but it was really quite a weird question to ask. Why would a 4 or 5-inch gun against anti-ship missiles? That's not what it's there for. And that's the questions like that are, I know why you're asking at night, but the questions like that are actually part of the problem. Not every weapon system is supposed to engage every threat. And if you're trying to look for a weapon system to engage every threat, you're going to end up with a very expensive weapon system which you're not going to be able to probably afford enough of. So some weapon systems are for some functions, some are for other functions, and this is the whole point of a ship. It's not an individual weapon system, it's built up of a collection of weapon systems, a collection of systems, a collection of capabilities that form together to form the overall value of the ship. And then you operate with other ships, and you have truly valuable capabilities. And no more questions until the end, that's what I'll say. But I will get through the questions which I got until Staircar's question. Mehdi, the problem is the modern era missiles are moving so fast that using phalanx-like systems cannot engage them out far enough to prevent a strike distance time issues. Well, the whole point is you should hopefully not be engaged if those missiles are moving that fast. And let's be honest, the number of missiles which you're talking about are the hypersonic ones. And realistically, you want to be engaging with layers. So don't think of the phalanx is, if they get through, basically you'll have your outer aircraft layer of your fighters with their missiles, trying to take out the attacking aircraft before they launch their missiles, or the missiles themselves if they're land-based or ship-based being launched. Then you have your own area air defense missiles. Then each ship will have its point defense missiles, probably, or the escorting frigate of a capital unit like a carrier. And then you'll have the guns. Now, again, I would say I do agree that I don't think Phalanx... I think the Phalanx 20mm is just not powerful enough for the task. I think you do need something bigger. I think that's mainly because the size of the missiles you're dealing with and the sheer amount of energy they're going to retain in their attack. So that's the thing. But that's more of a modern question, so I'm going to try and focus in on the Falklands questions. Kanaga, what were the lessons learned by the submarine aviation communities? Aviation community, I already talked about the airborne early warning. Submarines they wanted their torpedoes to work. Believe it or not, the British had torpedo problems. There's a reason why Belgrano was sunk with a World War II era torpedo, and there's a reason why the aircraft carrier escapes. We will leave that to one side, though. Carmen Gersberg, not relevant to this topic of conversation at this point, because neither of them were down in the Falklands, were they? I don't think there was any ship deployed with the AK-630 or Dardo twin 40mm down in the Falklands. That's an end of topic question, if at all. Rich Cross, looking at Tiger and Blake, do you think they were really unable to be sent? Yes. No, it wasn't the worry of losing such a large crew. It was that they hadn't been properly sustained and properly maintained. They just hadn't been properly looked after. Knights of Gatorand, demise of Sheffield and Atlantic Air caused a change in attitude to how they are in deals with anti-ship missile attacks. No, that was already the policy, and I'm not sure. I don't know where you're getting the idea that the Royal Navy thought the only thing they need to do to defend against anti-ship missiles was to deploy electronic countermeasures. I don't know where that came from. It's either a baiting question or you really need to read better in sources. Because, yes, the Royal Navy was trying to shoot missiles with their own missiles. That's actually a function of Sea Dart, and especially Sea Wolf, which was deployed before the war began. Daniel Pillars, are any of the land-based radar-targeted gun systems used for drop-in on ships? Usually, most of the radar-targeted gun systems that are on land are basically versions of the versions which are already built for ships. Usually. So, yeah. What did the Warsaw Pact and USSR learn from the Falklands? That Britain was surprisingly feisty. That was the major thing. The Soviets really didn't expect Britain to fight, and when they did, they were really going, oh, good God, the British are actually fighting. Gareth Eckler, I wonder, would the old Seacat missiles have ever been useful? I remember hearing Sea Slug saw some uses that kind of provides land attack roll due to how big it was. Would the Cat have uses? They were all used in air defense operations, and some claim they actually shot down aircraft. But, you know, the thing is, it's better to have something and fire it than have nothing. Channel, would the British Task Force commander have been served by stationing his HQ in Gibraltar, or did Spain's position on the wall make it unfeasible? No, because they didn't have a headquarters like Northwood in Gibraltar. So why would you station it in Gibraltar? You'd have to build a whole new headquarters. They have everything set up in Northwood. It wasn't really properly set up because it was supposed to be a NATO command post, and half the officers disappear because it's not a NATO operation, but that's life. Sarkar, what should anyone looking at invading Ireland learn from the Falklands War? If you're going to do it, make sure you bring enough forces to properly secure it. Anyway, with those questions all answered, and Stekar very nicely staying away from politics now, because the thing is, Stekar, I have to be equally firm on everyone for the politics stuff. If I'm going to stop the, especially, not Falklands, but the Ukraine stuff, turning the Ukraine stuff into politics debate, I have to be very careful about the Falklands stuff as well. With that being said, amphibious warfare and the Ukraine. All right, I'm going to need more Iron Brew before I get into this. I will get you biscuits as well, but I need more Iron Brew. Well, I do. I know I should be drinking water. I know water's better for me. No, I'll drink my water as well. Okay? Stop nagging me, poodle. The water's empty. Terrible. I'll have to have the iron brew. Yeah, I know. I promise I will drink some more water later. I promise, Raleigh. There you go. So, amphibious warfare. Now, realistically, the Russians were planning for Ukraine to be a 6-hour war. You can tell this because of how quickly they thought, based on 2014, the Ukrainians were going to collapse. They made the classic error of underestimating their opponent, and anyone who wants to argue that the Russians didn't underestimate their opponent, seriously, what war are you looking at? Basically, rather like with the Falklands, and this is why to an extent the two are applicable despite the geographical differences between the scenarios, where the Argentinians believed that the British wouldn't fight because the Americans wouldn't let them, and the British weren't going up to fighting anymore, and the British were no longer a power. The Russians were looking at their 2014 performance and presumed, okay, the Russian, we're going to stomp these people. We're going to walk completely over them. And... Stop. I know, but stop. And the reality wasn't going to be that way. It wasn't going to be that easy. Because 2014 was 8 years before 2022. And the Ukrainian armed forces had moved on a lot. A lot of the people who were weaker, less committed, less resolved, had already disappeared. A lot of the problems in the force had been weeded out. And 8 years will allow you to make a lot of changes in your force structure, especially in terms of personnel and senior officers. And the other problem for the Russians is they don't use time to bring in enough force. Now, I've seen people say that the Ukraine war means amphibious warfare is dead. No, it isn't. But for the Russians to have been able to actually carry out a successful amphibious operation, they would have needed sufficient enough force to suppress the strength of the Ukrainians enough they could do it. Now, the Ukrainians sink their own frigate, and so they scuttle it to prevent the Russians taking it. But it really wouldn't have been much help. But the thing is, the Russians, if you look at the forces they actually have deployed to the Black Sea, they have never deployed a significant force of their navy. It has never been deployed in force. If you look at where their viable ships are, their working warships are, they haven't deployed any of the Pacific, any of the Northern Fleet, even any of the Baltic. Realistically, they haven't deployed en masse all their working surface ships to the Black Sea to support an amphibious operation. And that's realistically what you needed to do. Now, I realise wars tend to be 6 hours, 6 days, 6 weeks, or 6 years. 6 hours, 6 days, 6 weeks, 6 years. Occasionally 6 months. There is this random thing that if you look at most wars through history, you can categorize them as 6 wars, which take less than 6 hours, 6 days, 6 weeks, some 6-month wars, and 6 years. We are well into a 6-year conflict. We are well into one. And that means that honestly a lot of these things are not going to be able to be done without sufficient force, because both sides are heavily entrenched. Both sides have a large amount of force deployed to preventing these things. And so they could do it. They can defend themselves. And again, the lesson of Dieppe, you cannot attack a heavily defended place and expect to take it. And so you have to go round. And the trouble is, the Ukrainian coast is most of the area where the Russians are already fighting. They're already fighting heavily in that area. So it's not as if you're going to be able to go off and go, we're going to land somewhere where they're not expecting us. They're expecting you. They have the anti-ship missiles. They have the weapon systems. They have the personnel dug in. And the absolute worst scenario for any force is urban warfare. Because your options in urban warfare are fight, door to door, house to house, room to room with infantry and sap out your troops and end up losing a whole lot of forces, or use artillery to level it. Those are your options in urban warfare. You level block by block, or you do it door by door. One makes you look an absolute sod and loses you the information war on the global stage. The other one loses you your infantry divisions. You lose your infantry divisions. The other problem for the Russians when it comes to amphibious operations and when they're planning them is that realistically, the naval infantry units, in terms of funding priority, are probably somewhere below the port of Vladivostok's guard dogs and somewhere above the Siberian border patrol in terms of funding allocations. They really don't come high up the priority list. We all know that the strategic missile regiments, they come first in terms of funding. Then comes the ballistic missile submarines. Then usually comes the VDV, their airborne forces. And then you can go down the various units. Naval infantry are very much at the bottom. Very much at the bottom. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, okay? Nations make priorities. They don't have infinite budgets. This is what I find weird when I start talking about this to people, some people go, no, Russia funds them a lot. And you go, well, no, in order of priority, they haven't been that high up. They haven't been able to take part in that many exercises. They haven't been able to test their equipment out. They haven't got much new equipment or much much capability in terms of equipment and testing it. And guess what? That means they don't really have much of an actual capability. And again, this is not to be unexpected because you only have so much budget and so much time. This isn't even a corruption issue. This is just a fact of life of being a government. It's a fact of life of being a government. And so whilst the Russians did have plans for amphibious warfare, they never got to really deliver on them. Because they didn't have enough force there to deliver it, and enough force there to protect it and project it. They didn't. And we'll get on to the issues of the force structure in a bit. Realistically, though, conversely, the Ukrainians, in terms of raiding, have been doing a lot of amphibious operations. A lot of amphibious operations. They are pretty much doing raiding wherever they want with almost impunity at this point. And that's a problem for the Russians because it shows that they haven't been able to invest properly in their own security. No, the Ukrainians cannot do major operations. They are not posturing, they're not able to do assault, and they're not able to do withdrawal by sea. But they are able to do raiding. They are able to do raiding, and they're doing it. The Russians have been trying to carry out some kind of supply and logistics, but again, the trouble is if you're going into port facilities and you're having to offload in port facilities, you're offloading in known locations, which are fairly easy to target. Because port facilities don't tend to move, and you can tend to Google them. Or, in the case of Russians and Ukrainians, Russia and the Russians in Ukraine, a lot of people have already been there and know exactly where they're talking about. Now, as I've already mentioned, you should be pairing ships up. You should be pairing ships up. And this is the other point I usually used to argue, that Russia had absolutely no respect for Ukraine as an enemy. Russia really didn't respect Ukraine as a threat. And that has bit them more than anything else in this war. Not giving your opponents any respect bites you more often than it bites them. It's helpful when your opponent thinks you're an idiot, because it means they're not going to realize when you're doing something to them. Because they're going to think you could never think of doing something to them. You know how I know Russia thinks Ukraine's an idiot? Because they were deploying ships on solo patrols. Even in the Falklands War, when the British ships are out picketing, it's a Type 44, Type 42, Type 44, Type 42, Type 22 combo. Sorry, well, tongue slip there. And this is the point. You deploy ships as pairs. The Moskva, as useful a ship as she was, if she had been fully upgraded and had actually had the result things she was supposed to have, rather than apparently her being fitted, well, the British system of corruption is fitted for, not with, where the money's never even allocated. The Russian system of corruption is it's going to be fitted honestly. She spent the time in the yard supposed to get fitted with it, and never actually seems to get the equipment. You can argue which one is worse. The American version of it is we're going to still order systems which we know, and systems and vessels which we know don't work, whilst hanging our equipment requirements off other vessels which we're trying to build that are going to delay and complicate the program to the point at which it can't be built. But don't worry, in the meantime, we're going to spend a lot of money on research and development, which is going to make a lot of shareholders of various defense companies very happy. Pick your poison. It's not corruption, it's perfectly legal. But it's not exactly good either. Because it's not corruption because no one's doing anything behind closed doors. Which kind of makes it worse, because we can all see it happening and we don't say anything and don't point out and go, but what we wanted was a frigate. We wanted a frigate. Why are we trying to turn it into do everything be everything ship? We just wanted a frigate to do our ASW work. Now, in this case, the Russians do have some quite good modern frigates. They don't have many of them because their supplier of turbines was Ukraine and they declared war on them. Again, I do sometimes think that most nations do not understand irony. Declared war on the supplier of your turbines, and now you no longer have access to those turbines. Oh, frigate. That's exactly the problem. We don't have a frigate. Realistically, the Moskva should not have been deployed solo. Even if she wasn't in the state that she was, even if she was well-maintained and had redundancy and systems, methodologies for self-defense, had been trained as highly as she could be trained if she'd worked in a Northern Fleet or Pacific Fleet and all these things, she needed to have another ship with her. She should have been operating in a pair. You don't send ships out solo unless you perceive there as being absolutely no threat. The example I will give is in 1939, January 1939. There is a problem at Tsingtao. A British merchant vessel, technically, the SS Vincent de Paul, has been taken in by the Japanese. Well, technically by the Coast Guard, who are operating in Japanese-controlled parts of China. And that's not allowed. If you have a problem with a British ship, you complain to the British authorities and then they investigate it. You don't take in British flag ships. So the British come storming up. Now they take up HMS Birmingham. A lovely town-class cruiser. And she comes storming up. But along with her comes a sloop. So you have this modern town-class cruiser of 10,000 odd tons, 12 6-inch guns, bristling, and you have a sloop coming along as well. Why do they send the sloop? Because you never send a solo ship into a high-threat scenario unless you have no other option. Because even having the sloop, the second ship, gives you other options. It allowed them, when they moored up, to moor one ship either side of the Vincent de Paul. It allowed them, when they were sailing out, for the cruiser to follow on behind while the sloop led the Vincent de Paul out. So if you tried to stop the Vincent de Paul, you'd have to cross the front of the sloop. The other hull gives you options. This is the problem with modern fleet size. And it's the problem learned in the Falklands War. And it's the problem learned in pretty much every single war has been, the moment you're doing operations, you do not want your ships operating solo. Now, whilst, yes, it would have been sensible to have an entire task force, let's be honest, we're not going to push the Russian Navy that far. But having a frigate and having extra things in a nice way, this should not have been the only ship they had there as their cruiser. They should have had other vessels out there. They should have been doing a rotation. That's another problem for the Moskva. The fact she was constantly on duty with no support, no replacement. And how should the Russians have arranged that? Well, probably they'd have had to claim they were doing a major exercise prior to the war in the Mediterranean, brought in ships from the Northern Fleet, brought in ships from the Pacific, brought them all together for the exercise, and then said, oh, they're coming back to the Black Sea bases for refit before going home, and then you start the war. And they need to have enough ships there to actually do the operations. Well, they didn't. They didn't respect their opponent. They didn't even respect themselves. And this is what you end up with. You end up with a ship getting sunk and getting lost, and no matter what state she is in, she's a loss of prestige, she's a loss of power, she's a loss of capability, and that's a problem for them. And she should never have been there solo. Never have been there solo. Branko Milikovic, what's amazing to me is that years have gone by and apparently the Russians can't jam Starlink effectively. Because jamming satellite links is incredibly difficult. Because they go up, they don't spread out, they don't spread round, they go up and they go down. And the trouble is with Starlink is there's so many satellites as well. So you can try overloading individual satellites, which you can do. You can try spoofing the individual satellites and overloading the data. And that's an option. But there are just so many Starlink satellites that becomes a very, very expensive, very difficult option. You could try shooting them down, but that would possibly lead to War of America. So basically, trying to jam Starlink is a massive hiding to nothing. And yeah. And then we get to the whole information still makes a difference. Oh, I'm surprised. I know, we're all surprised. Information still makes a difference. You see, when it comes to the Ukrainians, and I actually did, the reason I answered Miloševic's question is because Starlink is actually there. Being able to get information in and out of Ukraine is incredibly important. Being able to get information from outside sources with satellites, even commercial satellites, can provide a lot of data. Being able to access the internet and exchange ideas with engineers and scientists around the world and help to work on your own projects. The fact is, Ukraine has managed to develop a lot of systems very quickly because they've managed to harness their full economy. Now, this is not good long-term economic policy. Total war economy is not a good economy for peacetime. It really isn't. And the transition from a total war economy to a peacetime economy is never without problems and never without huge issues. But if you do transition to a total war economy, you can produce some very interesting stuff. And some very interesting capabilities. Now, the thing is, the drone issues and the capabilities of the drones that they provide is reconnaissance, mostly. Mostly what they provide for the Ukrainians is information. And this has been what the Ukrainians have been able to use all the time. They're able to use distance, time, and information to allow them to minimize the force required to hold up the Russians. They have turned the war into an attrition war from the get-go. And this has been the problem for the Russians, because they wanted to fight a quick war, because honestly, honestly, we are 3 years in, and they are starting to run out of usable old parts, old units, and old systems that they can rehab into viable systems. And there's actually some very interesting open source sites on YouTube and various other sources you can go to where you can find whole analysis of their artillery parks, thanks to commercial satellites. They're a lot of fun to watch. The Russians are trying to deal with this their own ways. They're developing their own drones. They're using their own systems, and both sides are in what is effectively now a very high-tech version of World War One. That's it. They're in a high-tech version of World War One. And that's often the case when you have a lot of technologies coming into service, but none of them mature. None of them are mature. They're still developing, they're still evolving. They still have a lot of potential, but they're not mature. And the thing is, as the Ukrainians have found, you can make your artillery very effective if you have drones. Because forward artillery observers and all these things have been a part of warfare for a long, long time. But if the forward observers can stay in a nice forward position, but can keep their heads down while the drone does the high-risk stuff of wandering around spotting for targets, then that's even better. Your forward observation teams don't have to reveal themselves. They don't have to be at the top of hills. They don't have to be in positions where you can almost work out where they are because what's been seen and hit. Because what they actually are is drone teams. Launching their drones to go off and do the reconnaissance. They get information, send it back. There's a fire mission from the artillery. Boom, boom, boom. And sometimes you can take things out with the drones themselves. Sometimes. Sometimes you call in artillery. You decide what is the best system available to do and be the most efficient for what you're requiring it to do. Because again, the thing that we don't like to talk about and we don't like to admit, especially in NATO, especially in the West, is that sometimes you do need overwhelming firepower. Sometimes you do need to suppress an entire field. That doing a pinprick is great. It's wonderful when that's appropriate. But sometimes you need more. Stekra, I know, I'm guessing that's spelling mistakes, but that's really not the language that's acceptable on this channel. I realise that's spelling mistakes, but that's not acceptable language for this channel. So don't do that again. I'm sorry to have to point it out, but it's not. So, yeah. Now, the thing is, as it's developed over time, as it's got better, you get more and more people going, oh, this is the new wonder weapon. And what I find funny is that realistically, there are weapon systems around which have been dealing with this for a while. For example, Dragonfire, the new laser system, which I've already talked about, that the British are working on. The British have been working on for a very long time. They've been working on it for about, I would say, Dragonfire's origins programs, what would you say? About 30 years? About 30 years, the origins of the programs, if you go back through the previous programs and things that have led up to it. 30? 35 years? 30 years, okay. And they are useful. They're useful. I'd also say that the thing about drones that keeps coming up, and people sort of forget about this, is how you're going to integrate them into forces. Are they going to become separate assets, or are you going to have different levels of drone for different situations? Are you going to have drones which support the artillery? Drones which are integrated into the infantry? Because the drones which your infantry teams need are probably very different than the drones your cavalry teams need. One of the fun things again about drones and this being the new newness is I remember pictures from the 1990s about future tanks, and almost all of them had these drones on them, which were going to provide them the reconnaissance and oversight. Literally, this has been around as a concept for about 30-40 years. The information warfare, though, still makes a difference. If the Ukrainians, their consistent advantage has been they've been able to react more quickly than their Russian counterparts. Able to get information on what the Russians are doing and react more quickly and get inside their operational loop and get inside their operational thinking. But also this is worked out in the wider information war. Because usually and consistently, the Ukrainians have uploaded more and more unedited footage, more just raw footage, than the Russians consistently in the war. Now, this doesn't mean they've never uploaded unedited footage. I'm not saying that. They've consistently uploaded more unedited footage. And this has meant that they've been in the information warfare terms, which again was part of the Falklands War, but that was far more limited as it was the Falklands, and there was not many civilian populations. There wasn't a day-to-day to the day. That has helped the Ukrainians shape the conversation. And this has had an impact on domestic political debates. This has had an impact on domestic politics in Ukrainian allies and in Russian allies. It's caused issues. It's caused debates. It's caused discurrency. And it's also caused a lot of people to question the analysis coming out from, especially the Russian allies, of their equipment performance. Now, I would say you have problems in that there have been people who've expected, but for both sides, the equipment to work like it said in the brochures. And for me and a standard poodle, well, sorry to tell you this, but arms salesmen are salesmen. They're still salespeople. They're trolls trying to sell you something. They're not necessarily going to be wholly truthful. They will never usually tell you an outright lie, because that could get them sued or shot. But expecting the whole truth, nothing but the truth, and 100% correct information is probably expecting far too much. They tell you, this missile has this range, and it does. Under best conditions, if best maintained, as brand new, if, at these settings, with this capability, this added in, on this kind of temperature, and this kind of day of the year. And that is life. Never trust the sales material. Correct, Derp Squad. No, you're not getting any more. You're not. I love you dearly. But you're going to get podgy. You're already 30 kilograms. You're not getting more. Go to sleep. And so, this has been something which has been coming for a while. These drones have been something that's coming for a while, the capabilities. I would argue again, if you want to look at a navy which is really well prepared for operations in littoral areas, i.e. within the sort of the 200 to 100 miles and the 100 to 0 miles from the coast, again, look at the Italians. They have been putting a lot of investment into those capabilities, but again, they're thinking about operating their training. If you're thinking about operating in the North Atlantic, well, believe it or not, small drones aren't much of a problem in the North Atlantic, because by the time they reach you out at any drone that's big enough to reach you at 200 miles is not that small. Any drone that's going to reach out at you 200 miles away, or manage to fly through Norway, which with all its mountains, and not fly at a level which is going to get it spotted, so I follow terrain following altitudes, is going to be big enough that you're going to see it coming, because it's not going to be any different than a small light aircraft. Raptor, okay, it's truth, as determined by marketing department. Yeah. Oh, yeah. By the way, and this is the other point for drone warfare, if people want the real fun, okay. I've seen a lot of different documents recently, and papers which claim various nations have built the world's first drone carrier, the first UAV carrier. I'm sorry. The Royal Navy beat them all to it in 1939 with HMS Argus, which was a... how do I put this politely? She was a Queen Bee operator. Now, the Queen Bee is also where we get the drone from, the phrase drone. Because the Queen Bee system were these drones, these uncrewed aircraft, Tiger Moths, which would be flown up, and ships would test their AA guns on them. And so, Argus was the first ever drone carrier. And that's actually where we get all the phraseology, drones, etc. from. It's from the Queen Bee system of the Royal Navy in the 1930s. So this is why when people tell me this is all brand new and no one's ever seen this before, I look at them as if they're ever so slightly ill-informed. Yes, the code name for Argus at one point in an exercise was Beehive. It's just, it gets... The fact that all this stuff comes from the British naming their system the Queen Bee drone system, the Queen Bee system, and then having drones and a beehive. And now we're talking about drones as these modern things, and you sit there and go... The very name for the system comes from the 1930s. It's almost 100 years old. And it was, in the nicest way, the drones were very nearly weaponized at night. The only reason they weren't is they didn't think that the command and control systems were, the radio control system they used would be too easy to jam. That's basically the reason why the British don't use those systems in World War II. But they were working on it. So let's look at the geography, because the geography of Ukraine is very different. It's very, very different to the Falklands War, but it's also, at the same time, very similar. Again, I'd point out that once you realise that the quite a lot of the coastline of the Ukraine has already been taken, especially quite a lot of the better coastline, because look at that geography. Look at that elevation and geography, and now think about, where do I really want to land and carry an amphibious operation here when I already control those bits? Now, you might go, well, you could do a landing at Odessa, but look what happens if you go into Odessa. You go straight into that. It's a very thin strip of land before you get into very, very defensible area. And again, you're going to be in range of missile and artillery from that high land. So, yeah, you don't want to do this. The physical and human geography of the war has a massive impact on it. This is not an expeditionary war. That's also another reason why it's going to be such an ongoing war. It is a war for national survival. For both sides, but for different reasons. It's internal politics, but it's both sides. For the Ukrainians, as the phrase often goes, for the war to stop, all Russia has to do is withdraw. The Ukrainians do have no mandate and wouldn't want to try and take Russian territory or try and do that. They don't have the forces for that and holding it, so they would just go, woohoo, peace it is. For the Russians, well, they've now staked so much political capital on this war, so much of their internal infrastructure on this war, so much of their nationhood on this war, they cannot back down unless they get something out of it. They can't. And that's the human geography of it. That is the human geography of it. Politics is as much part of human geography as the actual human bits of industry and town built up. The physical geography of Ukraine has also defined the war, because there are some natural defensive lines in Ukraine, and That's arguably one of the reasons why Russia was so interested in trying to take it over in the first place, or so worried about who was running Russia and that they must be running Ukraine and must be a Russian proxy. Because when you're looking at Russia from a nation which needs defensive depth and wants defensive depth, i.e. a nation which has survived the invasions of Napoleon, the invasions of the Swedish, the invasions of the Nazi Germany, the invasions of the Japanese, depth has always been their ally. Depth has always been the critical thing. And so that's what they want. They want depth. Now, the thing is, that's the physical geography. That's the physical geography of Ukraine. And that would have been a tremendous advantage. You can see, just looking at this map, you see an easily defensible line. You see where you would want to lighten your defences. You can see the areas where you could do attrition. You can see the areas where you can hold. You can see the areas where the blooming Germans were held up in World War II. You can see all these things at various points. But, and this is the glorious gluteus maximus of the scenario, they had telegraphed their punches rather a long time ago, and I would say whilst they could possibly make some claims about Ukrainian identity in 2014, thanks to 2014 and 2022 and the operations, they have managed to create even if Ukraine didn't have it, the equivalent of a foundational myth that is going to tie together the Ukrainian identity. Fighting and holding off Russia is going to be their foundational identity. And before people think, well, that can't be a nation's identity, Britain's national identity for many years was that we weren't the French. That was it. Whatever the French were, we were the opposite of it. That was the foundation of it for many years. And, for example, for fighting off the Russians, you only have to look to Finland, and that's pretty much a cornerstone of their national identity too. So, with this being said, what else are the geographies deciding? Well, for the Russians, the trouble is a lot of their infrastructure, a lot of their supplies and supports having to come a very long way. Whereas for the Ukrainians, whilst they might not be able to produce as much as the Russians, it's a very far shorter distance. What they can build themselves, it's very close. This war is very close to their centers of infrastructure industry. Very close to their ability to produce stuff. And they are getting more and more integrated into the European transport network and the various systems that their allies can supply them over every single day. There's all sorts of work being done quietly, roads being widened and improved, bridges being upgraded, railway lines being worked on. It's happening every single day. The reason is because, again, a lot of those nations looking at Ukraine and looking at the situation Ukraine's found itself are sitting there going, well, hang on. If Russia's successful in Ukraine, and this is a human geographical position, a human geography issue, but also a physical geography issue, they might try elsewhere. They might try elsewhere. In fact, they might be incentivized to try elsewhere. After all, why stop with one secure portion of your border when you can secure your whole borders? Now, the reality? The reality is that this geography and the fact that you have the Russian political system has staked so much of its survival on winning this war, at least has to win something from it to be able to save face, and that the Ukrainians cannot afford to lose this war or seem to lose this war because that could invalidate their own national identity, means this war is probably going to grind on for a long time yet. That's the sad thing sometimes. Humans can literally back themselves into corners psychologically and politically. They really can. Stekra, Austria was a nation before World War II. It's called the Austro-Hungarian Empire because Austria and Hungary were literally separate. Admittedly, Austria has shrunk since its massive size, but Austria was a nation before World War II. Austria was a nation for a very, very long time. So, the politics and the physical geography of Ukraine are interesting. It's also one of the interesting things when we start to consider the naval warfare, exactly how close in the Moscow was operating. Look at that map, and then go back and look at this map. Look at where Moscow was. Look. And she was operating solo. You don't do that if you have respect for your opponents. My friend, a nation can be an empire. After all, the Russian Empire became the Russian Federation, or rather, became became the Soviet Socialist the Soviet Socialist Republics, and then became Republic of Soviet Socialist Republics, and then became the Russian Federation. So yes, empires can become nations. Mark Vren, it's one of those little joys of history. Nationhood is an interesting thing and an evolving target. It's one of those things when you the more you get involved in studying history and international relations, the more you realize some of the hard and fast rules taught at earlier stages in education are rules of thumb, which make things easier for people, the teachers, to explain rather than necessarily fully accurate piece of information. Because there are exceptions to almost every single rule. There are exceptions to almost every single rule. It's the fun times. So, summary. Yeah, technology makes things more complicated. It really does, but it doesn't change the fundamentals. This is the point. I've tried to present this with the idea of you've got World War II, you've got World War One, you've got the Falklands War, you've got the war in Ukraine, and all these things have taught pretty much the same lessons over and over again, but we keep forgetting them because it's convenient to. It costs us less money if we forget them. The one thing I'm hoping is that when they get around to actually funding things properly, when we get round to funding things actually properly, and thank you, I've just spotted thank you to Wade Everett for the memberships. Thank you to everyone who's been gifting memberships and those things. It's very kind of you to do that. Memberships are a big thing when it comes to YouTube funding and YouTube as a whole. And how it works in the logarithm, but thank you. But the whole point is, these lessons get forgotten because also it's politically expedient to forget them, not because they're actually gone, and then they're learnt again. And this is the annoying thing for a historian like me. I became a historian because I believe a true historian is someone who learns to the past and passes it on. Someone who passes on the lessons of the past, passes on information. But the trouble is, I can't guarantee people will listen. And I can't make them take the lessons on board. I can't force you to understand the history. I can't force you to learn the lessons. I can give you the information, I can show you my analysis, and I can hope I persuade you. But I can't force you to, and I can't push it on you. Because you're humans. And that's the same for all historians. It's frustrating that they keep having to learn these lessons. It's frustrating that you have to make the case of, well, if we want to build a fully general purpose asset, it's going to need this amount of firepower. It's like the argument I would make, in a nice way, if I'd been designing the Type 31 frigates and the flak frigates, I would have probably armed them with 3 phalanx. I'd have put on them 3 double 76mm, that's 3 double 3-inch guns, which you can get from Otto Malera, and I would have put on 3 40mm guns. And that would have been how I would have set the ship up. So it would have had all that firepower to be able to defend itself as a flak frigate, and then added on a whole load of missiles and the capabilities, because it would be a case of, this is going to be my flak frigate. And I also made that the beginning entrance guns for what the Type 26 would have, and eventually the Type 83 and all these things, because that's how I would design them. And then people would go, well, you've put on so many guns. Why? Because they are my backup levels of insurance. Twin 76s, twin 40mm, and 3 phalanxes means I have incredibly thick layers of short-range air defense, incredibly thick layers of anti-small boat defense, incredibly thick layers within this area of, I have to, if anything gets in this area, I have to put it down hard and put it down fast. I can overwhelm it. And if one of these guns isn't working, that doesn't matter, because I have multiple others. But that's me, and that would be expensive. Anyway, I am sure there are a lot of questions coming in about Ukraine, and I'm going to try and answer them like I did the Discord ones. I'm going to, because of the politics thing and keeping an eye on the politics, I'm going to be slightly naughty. Normally, I would activate the bot. Tonight, I'm going to leave it to my very judicious moderators to pick questions. And again, I'll answer questions probably for about 45 minutes. And then I will put the puppy to bed. And then I will get some water, because if I don't, someone will tell me off, namely puppy. And then I will be on Discord to chat away again with people for a while, if they would like to. Now, with that being said, I'm going to open up the Discord again and see what questions have arrived. Okay. Kalinega, with the Russians being surprised, how much did the British standing on the world stage improve for the rest of the decade? How much prestige held over for the Gulf War? Basically, a lot of the British prestige and capability in warfare, and our understanding of our presence and what we could do on the world stage, rested on the Falklands War, and wasn't really lost until, you could argue, the 2010 Defence Spending Review got rid of the carriers. It was such a short-sighted sort of budgetary saving to get rid of the Harriers and the carriers. You need to keep both Harriers and Tornado around. You should have kept Harriers and Tornado around. It wasn't going to cost that much. We weren't exactly buying a lot of, but going to be buying a lot of them. We could have maintained them. They're not that expensive at that point. They're all assets already in service. Yeah, we managed to shoot ourselves in the foot in 2010. But yeah, the Falklands did help a lot. The Falklands was a very useful scenario for us in terms of us being, for the UK, in terms of being able to show that it had resolve. And I think personally that there was a question earlier, and I think pretty much any government found itself in that situation would have probably found itself having to fight. I cannot see any British government backing down without a fight. I think in some regards Thatcher was able to seize the moment far better than some of her counterparts would have been. But you're in a situation where if you don't fight, you're giving into a dictatorship. And the British public as a whole would not have electorally rewarded any government which did that. There is a lot of problems, even, with the idea in Britain today of people handing back the Falklands, let alone, and as a thing. That's one of the issues which actually came up on the doors in certain areas quite a lot during certain recent election campaigns when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party. It came up a lot on the doors. For a lot of people who were involved on both sides, they kept hearing about the Falklands and his position on that, and that was shocked quite a few pollsters. They honestly didn't think people would care, but they did. And the thing is, the Falklands, then it was the dictatorship taking it over. If the Falkland Islands themselves had wanted to go, the British public wouldn't have objected. But if the Falkland Islands didn't want to go and they were being taken over by a dictatorship, then pretty much that meant the British governments had to fight, or they would not win an election ever again. Tom Gasberg, speaking of the Phalanx and Goalkeeper, how did the AK-630 and the Dardo twin 40mm perform compared to them? They're quite good systems, but again, one of the problems is that I would argue the NATO doctrine has placed too much faith in sensors, and so they hope to engage in enough time that their small amount of force will work in it. The Russians tend to place their faith in sheer amount of firepower to make up for their sensors and their processing speed. So it's as simple as it's that distance, time, and firepower scenario again. You go for heavy firepower if you don't think you're going to have much distance and time. If you think you're going to have distance and time, you can afford to have small firepower. I think this is the problem which you're not going to see really resolved. Again, the Type 31s are a step in the right direction. They're armed with 40mm. There is the Millennium gun, which is a 35mm system. There are a few systems out there which are sort of slowly upping the firepower in the West, in NATO and those aligned nations. And I'll be interested to see. The Japanese recently are working on a railgun system, and that looks a really interesting weapon system. And that's going to that, if it gets into service, will realistically change things a lot. We'll see. Lions. Could you argue the Russians did a version of the UK in World War One Gallipoli? Sorry, Dardanelles, not Gallipoli. Dardanelles, Gallipoli, they're the same. It's the same place. It's different phrases for it. It's the Straits versus the landing spot. Or rather, the peninsula. Yes, they telegraphed their punches. They realistically did. They telegraphed their punches, and frankly, this is on them. It's one of the things when the Russians went in 2022, they had a chance if they managed to, if the Ukrainians had collapsed, especially with the attack on the airport, if they managed to capitalize on that and managed to move into Kiev fast enough and take it out before the Ukrainians were prepared and in positions, they had a chance. But if they couldn't get it done in 6 hours, I don't think they were going to have much chance of getting it done in 6 days. There was always the chance that Ukrainian supplies ran out, but the moment you started having supplies come in from NATO partners and nations supplying them and sending in as much equipment as they could and supporting them as much as they could, and that was going to buy them at least the next 6 months. And once you're through that, you're into a 6-year slog. And that's the reality. And to some extent, that, like him or hate him, the Ukrainian president played a blinder with Zelensky with many of the statements he made at the time. He really did manage to capture the mood and win the information warfare at that point. And, his whole saying he was going to stay and he just needed bullets, that helped. That helped a lot. And that was important because human politics has always been part of warfare. It's always been part of warfare. This is one of those things which people forget. They think about human politics and human geography, politics, and these things as being something modern because of media, etc. No, it used to be, yes, you had to win the minds of a small number of people, but you still had to win those minds. If you didn't get them, you got yourselves into trouble. If you didn't get the right members of the church on the side, the right members of the nobility on side, the right powerful merchants on side, you will soon run into trouble with a war. You needed to marshal all your assets and all your allies in order to be successful. Then apologies. I think you used to talk about 4-day active wars. Why did you switch to 6? No, I'm fairly sure I've always said 6. Sometimes I do play around with the do play around a bit with the numbers but it's usually 6. 6 hours, 6 days, 6 weeks, 6 months, 6 years. World War II, you have to remember, is 1939 to 1945. 6 years. 1914 to 1918. 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Oh, and there's a bit still going on to Russia into 1919. So usually we talk about 6s. There are specific some wars which were literally very short. So usually, basically, we'll sort of go: is it a war up to 6 days? So is it a war up to 6 hours? And then the things sort of change after that. If you get further than 6 hours, it's most likely it's going to be a 6. The odds are next it'll be a 6-day war. The odds are next after a 6-day war, it's going to be a 6-week war, a 6-month war, 6-year war. 60-year war is unusual. Usually that turns into more like a 100-year war, which is actually 113 years and has several breaks for them to rapidly rearm. Gareth Fairclough, there's more than 100 years war. There's a second 100 Years' War just between the British and the French. That's the wars in the 18th century and early 19th century. That's the second 100 Years' War. Look at how many wars the British and the French fight from basically 1700 to 1815, and you will find there is a second 100 Years' War. Yeah, I know there are various American generals who had predicted that Kiev was going to fall in a certain amount of time. I do realise that, but the thing is, that's also true for the Russian planners. That realistically, and also some of the NATO officers were literally hamming it up to try and get more resources out to Ukraine so they wouldn't fall. There's been a few 100 Years' Wars which haven't involved the British and the French. There's been a few very long-running conflicts as well. So yeah, it's rare but not impossible. And there's the whole Russo-Swedish wars, which basically were an ongoing thing. Let's not all start on the Danish-Swedish wars. No, Prime Flux, because that is not good. Lions, this might be too political a question, so feel free to ignore it. Do you think Ukraine would ever be allowed to join NATO? There will have to be a peace treaty with Russia beforehand, and it will be an interesting discussion. It'll depend upon all NATO members, because remember, NATO members to join, it has to be unanimous agreement. But I could see Ukraine joining NATO. I could also see them not joining NATO. I could see them ending up in a rather similar scenario to Yugoslavia in the Cold War, where Yugoslavia was technically Soviet aligned, but they were independent enough that basically they ignored Stalin and various other Soviet dictators on a regular occasion and were de facto their own independent, because they had managed to achieve independence themselves in World War II. They managed to drive the Germans out themselves. And I could see Ukraine ending up like that, but part of attached to sort of NATO. So basically they are NATO's very close friend, but not NATO. They are de facto part of NATO, but they're independent, and they're separate enough from NATO that everyone can pretend they're not NATO. I could see that being as the solution, but there would have to be various things to work through that. Gareth Fairclough, I wonder, would there be any place in modern Navy for a ship with larger caliber weapons, say an 8-incher? I've often talked about the future of railguns, and I often do say I think they could get bigger guns. So most of the railguns being tested were 8-inch weapons and 6-inch weapons, especially for long range, because if you're going to have a gun that can deliver things that theoretically, some of the railguns had a theoretical range if they were worked up to their full version of 1,000 miles. Probably it'd be a few hundred miles, but if you're going to be firing something for, let's say, 500 nautical miles in practice, you want to actually deliver quite a heavy piece of ordnance when you get there. Now, you might be going for a kinetic kill, in which case you want a big solid lump of metal, or an explosive kill with a big solid a lot of explosive going off when you get there. But that means you probably are looking at maybe something a lot bigger than a 5-inch weapon. Let's hear everyone. So, won't the Slava class Moskva's demise not end up teaching Navy's lessons? Oh, it should teach them lessons. It should do. As said, what I was describing earlier for the Type 31 fit earlier would really have made the Type 31s into a modern version of the Didos. But that's the thing. We would hope it would teach them lessons, but I think quite a lot of them are going to assuage themselves with the idea that Moskva had not been properly maintained, hadn't been upgraded, and therefore it's more down to the system's fault than the ship's fault. And that is to an extent true, but there's also the system's fault of there's only one ship on its own. And the trouble is, if you can find an easy answer which doesn't require you to spend extra money, people often do go with it. They often go with it. So that's, I think, the problem for that one. Sort of like pre-NATO, pre-joining NATO Sweden, yes. That is the other interesting thing. The Russian, if we go back to the geography here, Russia has managed to make it so Finland and Sweden have joined NATO. So the Russian border of NATO has gone up massively by invading Ukraine. This 2014, if they push further, they probably have won this. It's 2014 which they owe their problems to now, and the fact that they are now almost have made their situation probably immeasurably worse. Stecker, why do dictatorships and bullies always underestimate their opponents? Because usually they perceive niceness as weakness. If you speak the language of force and your opponent doesn't, it's very easy for you to presume that your force is going to annihilate them. I dealt with this myself at school. It didn't end well. Prime Flux. Any thoughts on the 40mm 3P ammo? It's fairly useful. The programmable 40mm, that's pre-fragmented programmable proximity fuse systems, especially forward by BAE, are really going to be quite an advantage, especially for the weapon systems which are going to be in the Type 31. The fact that it's for both the 40mm and the 57mm can both be fitted with them is going to be probably very useful for the British and for other allies, but I would still like to increase the rate of fire. I still think you should be going for double mounts, not singles. The trouble is, since World War II, the emphasis has become more and more on precision. And that's useful up to a point until you forget what weapons are for. 40mm, 57mm, and the close-in weapon systems are for putting down threats when they've got within a zone where they can cause you damage. You want to put them down fast, you want to put them down hard, and you want to put them down last minute. Not now, you want to put them down a minute ago. That means, ultimately, you need more barrels. You need to up your rate of fire more than a single barrel can deliver. So, Yeah, that's more my problem with the modern gun systems, is that they're mostly orientated around single barrel systems, because that's more accurate. Because if you've got a two barrel system, twin barrel system, if you're firing, it can throw you off slightly, so it can throw off the small margins and induce inaccuracies, and that's all true. But if we're in the range where if that missile hits me, I'm going to be suffering at least a mission kill, if not have to go home, if not be destroyed, I'd rather be filling the space out of the air with lead and worry about whether I hit it precisely exactly where I want to on a missile later. Yeah. That's good. Probably didn't help that this is from Dirt Squad. It probably didn't help that Russian tank crews had been selling their fuel in Belarus. Yes and no. That's kind of overstated to an extent. There are some issues that Russians have had. Honestly, the fact is that their people didn't have enough food. One of the biggest problems from a logistics perspective the Russians have is getting supplies actually forward, which leaves the troops in a very bad position of how do they sustain themselves. And that always causes complications. You don't want your army to be living off the land. You don't want your army to be foraging for food. That means they won't be there when you need them to be. We talked about a battle in Nile recently in a video, and the problem for the French fleet, realistically, at that point, was a lot of their crews were ashore foraging for food. Because Napoleon had taken a lot of the ship's food and ship supplies with him. Think about that for a moment. The fleet crews were ashore foraging for food, so they weren't there to man their guns when the Royal Navy showed up. That's a problem. Jacob Vanek. Dr. Alex, do you see small explosive packed USVs being acquired by most navies as something akin to torpedo boats? I wouldn't be surprised if they start looking at them. I'm not sure if they'll actually acquire them. They're one of those systems whereby I foresee nations having designs but not building them until they need them. Because they'll pretend they don't need them. Because if you start buying them, it gets expensive. They probably will. They probably buy a lot. Have a lot of USV work going on for minesweeping. They probably have a lot of USV work going on for other issues. But honestly, small explosive packed USVs akin to torpedo boats. Most navies will go, well, hang on, we have rather long range torpedoes. Do we need these in peacetime? In wartime, they might be useful. In peacetime, can you use a regular torpedo for it? That's the thing. Again, some of the systems the Ukrainians are using, other powers wouldn't need to use because they have other systems to use. No worries, David. As I've said before, and I'll say this again, this is coming up in a couple of videos later because there's been a lot of comments about it. I used a doctor here because I originally started this channel to talk to my students, and that's my professional title. And I have my PhD because I'm stubborn, and because when I was younger as a dyslexic, I was told I wouldn't even be able to get to university, let alone graduate from one. So I went and got a PhD from King's College London's War Studies Department, in a topic I loved and was really keen on, but more importantly, so I could turn around to those people and go, I have a PhD. I am, however, one of those historians who also regularly reminds colleagues who say that you need a PhD to be a historian that actually the career and profession of being a historian predates their being PhDs. It's like the awarding of PhDs predates their being a medical doctors. So, no, the PhD doctors didn't take their title from the medics took their title from us. But you didn't used to need a doctorate to be a historian, and you didn't even need a doctorate to be a medic. Most surgeons were barber surgeons. They were called Mister. It's all fun. It's all some fun in history. Wayne. Railguns for anti-satellite use. It's a potential, but again, it's going to be doing the maths on it and making sure you have you have the sensors and the capability to organize it. And also, that's going to mean your railgun is going to be having to fire very, very fast. Because remember, to break orbit, you need to be going Mach 7 or above. So you're going to need to impart a lot of energy onto that projectile. But there again, it could be a saber projectile because to take out most satellites, they're not exactly armored or designed to deal with the kind of puncture you could deliver if you're actually going for a kill system. So, yeah, but then you have to remember any satellite you damage, what goes up could well come down in places you don't foresee, and some of those satellites, do you want them to come down in places you can't control? So it's all interesting. Anti-satellite missiles with various warheads which are designed to disintegrate the entire satellite are probably a more practical methodology, unless we want to fill up the space in the near Earth orbit with a whole load of shrapnel, which will make space flight very intriguing and very risky. Manly 640, they said I would never even get to university. I would never even be allowed into university because of my dyslexia. So, yeah. Examariner. Question Alex. What is your predicted endgame on the Ukrainian-Russian conflict? No pressure. I don't see diplomacy working because I don't see the Russians necessarily wanting to listen to it yet. I honestly see them grinding out for at least another 3 years. I really do. I think it's going to go until 2028, and I think then they'll probably be at a point at which the Russians and the Russians can't push anymore, and they will probably end up being a peace treaty. I think I hate to say this because it's kind of like asking which counties of the UK would I like to sacrifice for peace. I wouldn't want to sacrifice any. But I have a feeling there are going to be sections of Ukraine which the Ukrainians are going to have to surrender, basically, for war to be over. But also, I would say there is another variable into it. As Leslie's put, if Putin dies, there is also the variable of a lot depends on the American presidency and what else happens in the world. Because I think if other major conflicts break out, the Ukraine conflict could get subsumed into them. And that could end the war very quickly. But I hope fervently those conflicts don't break out. I really do. However, I moved my family to Cornwall, so make it out what you will about my worrying about the odds of such conflicts breaking out. Frank Spasato. What used to be the reason for building ship class in 4s in Mod 1 versus doing it today? Today we build at least 4, so you guarantee one available at any one time. In that period, they were building 4 so that you would have a working half a division of a squadron, because a squadron would be 8 to 9 ships. So building 4 would give you half a squadron, a division of ships, which would have commonality. And then you build another 4 of a slightly modified design, and that would be your squadron. So if you look at the Royal Navy, that's what they're doing with their 13.5-inch ships, that's what they're doing with 12-inch ships, that's what they're doing with their 15-inch ships. The fact they're building 5 Queen Elizabeths, and then Agincourt is going to be the 6th, and then they are building the 8 of the R-class. That's building a full squadron of Rs. That's where the We Want 8 comes from. It's not just a catchy slogan. We want 8. We want a squadron of battleships. That's what the 8 is. Building 6 Queen Elizabeths, well, that gives you a flagship. If you consider combined with the 8 Rs, especially once they're being built, that gives you 2 squadron flagships, a fast division, and a heavy squadron of 15-inch. That kind of works out quite well. But yeah, so basically, it's the rule of free is off what we have to use. You have one ship constantly available. You have to factor in one ship in refit and one ship in training or returning from operations, or otherwise not really deployable. To guarantee one ship at sea on operation at all times, that's what you need the fourth. And that's why whenever you're looking at strategic deterrence, you start looking at them and go, oh, the French have four, the British have four, the others are multiples of four. Oh. And you can work out how much its at sea strength normally is quite quickly from that. So this is the point when people go, yeah, we've got two carriers. And I go, that's a capability. That's an availability, not a capability. You see, one is a white elephant. Two is, when it's available, we are capable. But, three is a capability. Four is a constant. Three, you usually have one available. Four, you always have one available. So if your force is able to be divided by four, you'll always have at least one available. And the thing is, things start to compound. Once you have five, you usually have two available. Once you have six, you can guarantee you not always have two available, because again, you can work it up. If you're building 9, let's say, usually you're going to have 4 available. Want to guess why that is? Because the more ships you have in a group, the less often you have to adjust things like maintenance and refit schedules to deal with emergencies. So the more predictability you can run into your force, so the more you can maintain a force strength. That is the reality of it. And this is why when I talk about the Type 45, and I go, well, if they'd had 9, they'd have had this, if they had 12. If you had 12 Type 45s, you'd usually have 6 available for operations. 6. By the time you get to 12, you usually have 6 available. Why? Well, you're still probably going to have 2 in deep refit. But you might be thinking, well, hang on, that's divided by 4, that should be 3 constantly available. Well, no, because you're going to have at least 2 to 3 in deep refit, heavy refit. At least 2 in mainline training, 2 returning from operations, 2 probably in short refit. So that's 8, and 4 constantly available. Now you think about those ships. The ones in coming back from operations, and one's going for training. You can probably adjust without causing much issue into availability. So that means you actually have 6 available for operations at short notice, out of 12. But out of 6, you're lucky if you have 2. Okay. Kanaga, as an academic, what is the current status of Ukraine's university system, and have you any regular conversations on faculty over there? I don't have any conversations with any faculty over there now. When I was at King's, I used to know quite a lot of Ukrainian academics, work with them, but I haven't since I've not been there. I'm always happy to talk to them, but I haven't been contacted by anyone and haven't been included in that. It's one of the weird things when you taught at the university I did, and you had students from all around the world, and I had classes which had Russians, Ukrainians, Americans in. Back when I was teaching at King's, they'd have lots of Brits in. You'd have a fairly big masters group or something like that, and you'd be teaching them, and they'd be lovely. But yeah, I don't have any ongoing conversations with any faculty in Ukraine at the moment. Currently, I'm trying to build up some conversations with Japanese faculty. I have to admit, because we're going on the Japan trip, and I thought, well, is there any university which would like us to come and talk in Japan? And well, their museums are interesting, very nice, very friendly, but interesting to get in contact with. It's been an experience. Overall, a pleasant one, but a complicated one. I'd say a large chunk of that is down to linguistics issues, but that's on me because my Japanese is very, very limited. But yeah, the universities, getting in contact with them and talking to them hasn't really got anywhere yet. I haven't had any responses from the universities. Gareth Fairclough, couldn't uncrewed systems be used for other things? Perhaps to have a boat which is a big flatbed that can be fitted with a whacking great explosive in wartime and other stuff beasts? Oh, they often are.
They often are. A nice way, go look up the UK's minesweeping operations. There's been a lot of interesting talk recently about what the UK would contribute if the Iranians had closed the Straits of Hormuz, and it would be in a minesweeping operations. And the big problem out there was that we only had one USV out there, one uncrewed surface vessel. Okay, we had one minesweeper and we had one USV. Usually, you operate them in roughly sets of 3 or 4 USVs per minesweeper. But we only had one out there, and we only had one working minesweeper out there because that vessel is, or rather, a mine clearance vessel. One of the vessels is still in maintenance. So yeah, that was rather a reduction. But usually, you should have more of those USVs. One of the problems with having enough USVs is honestly the government has been very slow to procure. We talk about F-35s, but compared to some of the programs, the F-35 is well funded and is well up the procurement stream. Despite the fact that by the time we get on to tranche 3 of the F-35, it's going to be competing with Tempest for funding. We'll leave that to one side. That's that's one of the other reasons I'm annoyed with the whole not buying 12 additional aircraft as the F-35As, but converting F-35B procurement to As, because I can just see it causing more and more problems down the road in terms of delivering carrier capabilities. And we are supposed to be aiming for 36 F-35s per carrier availability, which is a full structure of you need 72, which means to do that, you need to have, if you're going to that, you have to deal with a third of your aircraft being in deep refit, at least, plus training and operational conversion. So realistically, you need about 120 aircraft on your strength, and once you add everything up, you end up with the 138, 144 aircraft being the minimum requirement number for all you need to do. And now they've converted 12 of those to F-35As, which means that's a pool of aircraft we can't draw from to use for the carrier strike capability. They are always going to have to be attached to the NATO role and the pilot training role. And the thing is, that's going to cause issues. Frank Sonnett, do you enjoy playing any nuclear strategy games? I've had to play a lot of nuclear strategy games over the years. I don't particularly enjoy them. I'm a weird person in that I tend to specialize in what's called conventional deterrence. This is not because I don't believe in nuclear deterrence, it's just that there's a whole lot of people who study nuclear deterrence. There seems to be very few people who study conventional deterrence. So, one of my catch lines, which I occasionally use when I'm doing consultancy and occasionally you'll see on my profiles, is conventional deterrence theorist. And I've written a lot of papers over the years published in various sites about how to do conventional deterrence, how to deter conflicts with conventional force, and the realities and risks of doing that and how you manage it. So yeah, I've played the nuclear strategy games. I've played them. The thing is, the equivalents for conventional deterrence are very, very limited and very lacking. Sadly enough. Kanlega, so given your availability argument, shouldn't we see a third Queen Elizabeth class carrier today? Well, here's the funny running joke about the Queen Elizabeth class. Because of the various machinations of Gordon Brown, David Cameron, and others, we ended up paying for 3.5 carriers in paying for the cost of the build costs, because we paid them to build slowly, and various other things. Took delivery of 2. Yes, we should have had a third carrier. The other argument is you go back to the SDSR 1998 and the discussions going around then, and the idea would have been to have 2 strike carriers like the Queen Elizabeth class are, and 3 LHDs, which would have replaced Ocean, Illustrious, and Argus, and probably Albion and Bulwark eventually, in terms of that role, and they would have also been able to operate F-35Bs in the full air group, and so you'd have 5 flight decks which could all operate F-35Bs, and so that would have been the pool of resources the British had, and 3 large well decks, and then some LSLs to back it up, and that for Britain would have been a sensible force structure. Because that would have meant we would have always had at least 2 flight decks available. And most of the time, one of those flight decks would have been a carrier, and one of those flight decks would have been an LHD. Sometimes it would have been 2 LHDs. But either way, we'd have usually had, thanks to those 5 flight decks being the force working together, usually had the availability we need. And that would have been sensible for Britain and would have given Britain an expeditionary capability and a warfighting capability which would have been commensurate with its commitments and its global necessities. Because Britain is one of those strange global trading economies which is so interconnected into the world economy that we really do need things to be running properly for us to be able to operate.
And that's it, basically. That's what you need to do. Knight 6831, that's... you're really asking some of the stupid questions this evening, excuse the French. And I do say there's no such thing as a stupid question, but... and there really isn't, because it's worthwhile asking.
Quiet. No. You'll be called for bed when it's your bedtime. Until then, stop the complaining.
But... it's kind of an obvious answer, this one. If you had a third Queen Elizabeth class being built, you would have recruited to maintain the third Queen Elizabeth class. So you would keep your... you'd have had to raise your service numbers higher. You'd have had to recruit them more. That's it. Asking the question now of, do we even have the crew for a third carrier, a Queen Elizabeth class, to go today? The answer is obviously not, because we don't have a third Queen Elizabeth class carrier. So we haven't recruited to have that level, haven't retained personnel to have that level. But honestly, Knight, tonight some of your questions have been a bit off. I do expect better quality questions from you as a rule. No. No. I don't care. The answer is no. I know you think it's bedtime. But the thing is, until someone comes to get you for bed, it's not your bedtime. You don't get to dictate when the humans go to bed. They are watching their TV programs. Their bedtime is not defined by a poodle. You're cute, but it's not. And as Gareth Fairclough has just put it, Catelyn Gareth has just put it, and Gareth Fairclough put it, you're only crewing the third would be in the yard. Pretty much, you usually always have some crew attached to it. You always have some personnel. Down! You're not going to use my bed either. No. Good boy for coming down, but no. It might be bedtime, but you do not seek out the nearest bed and just go and plop yourself on it. No, it doesn't. And, you know, that's the reality of those things. You recruit, you crew to them as a force you have. Now, you're always going to have problems with getting enough crew. You're always going to have enough problems with recruiting enough people in peacetime because of the realities. There's going to be higher employment posts elsewhere. But one of the things you find with services as a whole, they have a better time recruiting when they are slightly larger. Why? Because they can give more of a guaranteed employment. There's more opportunities for longer term service. One of the problems that's constantly with cutting ship numbers and cutting things down is you keep cutting off the careers of people. People might be looking forward and thinking, I can have a 20-year career where I can grow up and I can go into this rank and this rank and this rank. And suddenly you take out those ships and suddenly those positions are lost. And suddenly their chances for getting up are lower. And they can't get them. And so they start going, well, is there going to be a career for me? And then I get out. And that's what... you always have to balance the people leaving the service with the people entering the service. And again, you have to remember that that Queen Elizabeth and Prince of Wales are theoretically replacing in service, although she hasn't quite gone, Argus, Ocean, Illustrious, Invincible, and Ark Royal. So they're replacing 5 ships. So yes, if you had been going to replace them with 3 ships, and you had run it more sensibly, the probability is you could have kept that crew in. And the reason why that's a question I wasn't expecting from Knight is because Knight is actually pretty darn well informed of these things and studies them a lot. So when Knight asks questions like that, I go, "Excuse me, Knight? You're either asking a loaded question, or you're playing dumb, neither of which suit you. You're better than that." I do like having the regulars. I love having new people here and including them and getting more and more people involved in general, but I do like having regulars. I can twist their tails so much more than I can the newbies. Frank Spanner, does that rule of 4 work with aircraft and tanks too, or do they use different setup? Pretty much rule of 3 and rule of 4 works with pretty much all military equipment because of because of what you put it through. You have to consider what you're training the stuff to go through. It's one of the problems when you realise that the software to work out the use of how that was used to justify reducing the altitude carriers was based on lorry management software and lorry fleet management software. And the thing is, running a lorry fleet is very different than running aircraft carriers. You don't have to suddenly unpredictably go to high speed to respond to crises with a lorry fleet, as a rule. And you usually can and if you do find yourself in need of more lorries because you're short of them, you can buy them or rent them quite quickly. You can't buy or rent an aircraft carrier that quickly. Thank you, Callanagan. Bowman, it was a worthwhile question because I learned something from it. Yeah. But you see, the thing is, I would have, if I'd put that in terms of, if I'd been thinking about that in terms of putting that from Knight and expecting as Knight normally write it, Knight would have go, but what about the problems of crewing a third Queen Elizabeth class? Rather than we couldn't crew a third Queen Elizabeth class. What about the problems of it? And Knight would normally ask a question like that instead of loading it. And that's the scenario. Yeah. So that's why I was telling Knight off. Because he asked better questions than that. He's probably the person who's asked the most questions on this channel by a long way. And he asks some very good questions. But sometimes he really drops the ball in his wording of the questions. And I will hold him to the higher standard because he sets himself it. Now, Stafford, in terms of need for more gunpowder, are there plans to retrofit twin mounts on Type 26, or has that lesson still been forgotten? No, that's not going to get fitted. I wish, but no. Follow-up from Stafford. With the uncrewed vessels being mainly gun platforms or missile platforms, there'll probably be a mixture of all of them. Gareth Aircloud, lorries are always with loaded questions. Empty lorries are not good. No, they're not. Yeah, I've not been thinking up new questions as much as before lately, as I've got a large questions backlog. So it's tricky to think up new questions that I've not already asked before. So is this? Are you saying poor performance in questions because you're all questioned out tonight? Do we need to send you on a holiday to recover your question ability? They'll come. You're good at them, but you can ask better ones. Next time, the Navy were issuing compulsory redundancies back in the 90s for senior non-commissioned officers. Nowadays, they're crying out for them. Yeah. Because the trouble is, it's turned into a boom and bust system, and you can't run a boom and bust system efficiently. You cannot run a boom and bust system. Do we have any more questions coming in? Because we've been live for roughly 3 hours, and I'm going to say last questions, and then I'm going to go. Oh, John Shea, using a system for trucks for using aircraft management on a carrier. No, it wasn't for managing aircraft on the carrier. No, the truck system, the truck fleet management system, was the basis software which was adapted to the software which was used to work out the availability of carriers, so they could say, well, according to the computers, if we have 2 carriers, we'll always have one available for operations. So it was the software, basically. Have I missed someone? I think they've all got green dots as far as I can see. No, I answered the uncrewed guns or missile platforms, Stafford, from Stafford, Paul. I said it's going to be a mixture of both. Yeah. The trouble is, Boom and Bust got into all sorts of issues. That's the way life goes. No worries. Right. What have we got coming up? Next week, we have Pierre-André de Suffren, which you should have seen. That's coming up. And I think also next week, if I'm not mistaken, you have the Saturday video, which is going to be a fun one. Next week's Saturday video is going to be... Check the dates. Tomorrow's video is Chushinuguma, the creation of the Kiribatai's Kaiga no Kujo, i.e. the Vice Admiral in charge of it. Saturday is leadership of the Russo-Swedish War. That's currently the 5th of July. That's the 5th of July, yeah. Then next Saturday we have... Then we have Suffren, then we have Tomcat, and then we have why the Royal Navy didn't go for high pressure boilers. That's the 12th of July. And then this one will come out on the 19th of July as the Saturday video on the 19th of July. Glad to hear that, 9681. I'll look forward to reading it. Yeah, that's the trouble. Seneca are also running fleets of dozens of lorries, and as said, with lorries you can hire one. If you're short a lorry, you can hire one. You can't hire another aircraft carrier. Excellent. Why can't the UK design a catapult? We could design a catapult for an aircraft carrier, but the reason we haven't put catapults and then go with them is, again, you go back to the whole debate, and I did a whole video on the Queen Elizabeth class and why they still work. But you have to remember, the idea was, again, at the beginning, there was going to be LHDs, and it was going to be an LHD is never going to be as fast as a carrier because it's got a huge well deck in it. So it's never going to be able to do that. So you wanted a Vistal approach, so you have 5 flight decks you could use the same aircraft from. And then you have one pool of aircraft, 5 flight decks, and you could adjust those flight decks around providing the strike aircraft. In emergency, LHD could fill the role, or a strike air defense role, or in, you can operate helicopters from the aircraft carrier if you need to, and all those things. And it makes a lot of sense. For a medium power, it makes a lot of sense. And as it kind of shows the French, they are probably the most dependent carrier air arm of anyone. As much as they stream independence, go and look at how much of their force structure depends on going and training in America and using facilities in America because they're running a single carrier, which is Catabar. If you've been going for free carriers the whole way through, and you'd been building air groups for those free carriers and task groups around those free carriers, going for free Catabar carriers and developing our own Catabar system would have been sensible. After all, BAE are the ones who are developing the modern catapults, the electronic catapult system. So it would have been quite easy to work with, the emails. But that's the way the history crumbled. That's the way it worked out. So yeah, that's the way that's the scenario we ended up with. We ended up with two carriers, and we ended up with the systems we've got. So we could have developed those, but we didn't go down that route. We didn't do the sensible things. Debate about beer guts going on. Oh, no. Nicest way, as long as they don't have the call-up managed by Capita, we might actually get actually some forces, but leave that to one side. Stafford, I did get a good laugh about how they misloaded task forces when I was delivering appliances. That happened to me several times. Yeah, you always want to load the stuff that you're going to have to unload first. You always want to do that. Right then.
So that being said, we've got Pierre-André de Suffren next Tuesday and all those things coming up, and Brew Ships is on Sunday. I'll look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Take care and have fun.